A War Story featuring Billy from Fazakerley by Dakota-Storm Boggan Thompson.
"You stupid bastard!" screamed Stanley. "I said throw the bloody grenade, not hold on to it." Stanley was pointlessly hurling abuse at the remains of a man blown up by a German potato masher. He'd picked it up and not realised how long it took for them to go off. He was new in that morning. "Will you shut up?" said Angus. "Go back to the bloody islands where you belong," said Stanley sharply. Angus stood up and in 3 steps was standing in front of the Londoner from Putney Bridge. "What did you say to me?" said Angus. Angus is 6 feet and 2 inches tall, while Stanley is only 5'9". But despite the difference in size, they both possess the same attitudes, and if they came to blows, neither the Germans, the Russians, the British, or the American army could do anything to stop them. "What's going on here?" says a hawk-eyed major. "They're just ruffling each other's feathers up," replies Cormack, an Irishman from Limerick. "They do this sometimes is all." "I see," says the major, who swiftly walks away. The fighting has stopped for a short while, and a small man starts up a fire to make some tea. They've probably got an hour's worth of peace before they're back on the job. A few minutes later, 4 grimy metal cups are filled up with hot, steaming tea. "Tea's up," he calls to the other 3. The small man is from Wales, and doesn't talk to many of the other soldiers, just these 3. "Cheers, Gruffen," says Stanley, taking his cup from the Welshman. They all sit in silence, looking hard into their cups. "So," says the Irishman abruptly, "who fancies a game of snap?" The 4 friends sit down to the game, and the Irishman fishes his oily pack of cards from his pocket and begins to cut them into 4 sets for each of the players. They all carry their own packs of cards, and whoever asks for a game produces their own pack. The 4 comrades play snap for about half an hour, before the first distant shots from a German machine gun are heard. The Irishman picks up his cards and puts them back in their packet, being careful not to tear any of them. They were a gift from his uncle. The major comes back with bad news. "Lads," he says with pity in his eyes, "I don't know what you did to annoy the top brass, but they specifically want you to go over to the Germans and give them a shock." "Just the 4 of us," says the Scotsman in disbelief. "I'm afraid so," says the major. "If you ask me, it's completely balmy. But they also said that if you come back in one piece, that you'll have triple rations for dinner." "That makes it worth the trip," says the Welshman sarcastically. They chuckle a little. It's a suicide mission and they know it. The top brass hate them with all their hearts. "When do we move off?" asks Stanley. "You've got 15 minutes, replies the major. "Just long enough for me to finish writing my letter," says the Scotsman to no one in particular. He is writing home to his mother. He always does on a Thursday. He knows that the mail can sometimes take weeks to get to Glasgow, but at least there's always a constant stream of it to his beloved parent. "I'm sorry it has to be you 4, says the major. The major is a good friend of these 4 men. They saved his life when he first arrived, and there is no doubt in his friends' minds that he fought tooth and nail to stop their suicide mission. "Who's in command?" asks Cormack. "Gruffen is," replies the major. "This is a grenade-throwing job." "Look who's going up in the world then, eh?" says Stanley, patting the Welshman on the shoulder in a friendly fashion. "Aren't I lucky?" says Gruffen to himself, more than anyone else. Angus finishes writing his letter and hands it over to the major. The major hands Gruffen the file containing the information necessary to complete their mission. The intrepid 4 put their bravest face on and crawl over the top of their little trench into what can only be described as hell. Bodies litter the land. An endless stream of bloated rats scurries between its meals. The ambush party drop to the floor as a bored German machine gunner takes pot shots at a lonely barrel lying on its side. Join the army, I said. It'll be fun, I said. Bastards, says Stanley. How long do you think this job's going to take us? The Irishman asks Gruffen. As long as it takes, replies Gruffen. I knew a cousin who went on a mission like this not too long ago. He took 15 men. Not one came back. That's comforting, said Angus. After this I'm going to ask for a better pie, says Stanley, spitting a lump of mud out of his mouth. Half an hour later, the 4 men reach the German trench and pretend to be dead bodies as a couple of carefree German soldiers walk past them. I have an idea, says the Welshman in such a quiet voice that it can barely be heard. What is it then? Says the Scotsman. This is a suicide mission, correct? Says the Welshman. Well, what if we sneak into the enemy lines, have a look around, and if any of us get to go back, then we'll be given 3 days leave for getting vital information. You're off your bloody rocker, mate, says Stanley. We wouldn't get 3 inches. I could do with 3 days leave, says the Irishman. There's a girl in the town behind our lines that I wouldn't mind seeing again. Stanley agrees to go through with it on the condition that they pay for the drinks when they get back. The 4 men slither down into the German trench and stop regularly to avoid detection. They soon find themselves in the midst of Panzer IIIs and IVs, several Panthers, and a much treasured Tiger I. I've got a better plan, Angus whispers to Gruffen. What is it then? Asks the Welshman. Why don't we commandeer one of these tanks? Says Angus. That way we can blow the stuffing out less lot and be protected while we do the job. Who says the Jerrys won't just blow up one of their tanks to get rid of the problem? Queries Stanley. Well, says the Scotsman with a grin, they wouldn't want to blow up one of their Tiger tanks, would they? We don't even know how to start it, though, protests Cormack. We might not have to, says the Welshman. Look. At that moment, a tank crew boards the Tiger I and begins preparations to start up. The big Maybach engine throbs to life and the flames from the exhaust look like they're a mile high. Come on, says the little Welshman, let's take it. Silently and expertly, the 4 men climb up onto the tank and knock loudly on the cupola hatch. A fat German tank commander pops his head out and before he can scream, has been hit on the head by the Scotsman. The Scotsman heaves the fat commander out of the cupola and Stanley throws a smoke grenade into the turret. Within a minute, the tank crew has bailed out in belief that their tank's engine has decided to kill them. The tank crew open all the hatches and let the smoke vent out of the giant vehicle. Before the German crew can get back into their tank to see what the problem is caused by, they have been knocked out harshly by the intrepid 4. Hang on a minute, says Stanley. How many people are meant to operate this bloody thing? Well, we've knocked out 5 people, says the Irishman, so I guess it's 1 more than us. We can manage, says the Welshman. Cormack can drive. He's driven tractors before. Angus can load the gun. It's probably not too different to a howitzer. I'll aim and fire, and Stanley can tell us who's approaching by peeking through the vision slits. The 4 men get into the tank and ready themselves. They lock all the hatches and discover that the Tiger I has a full complement of shells, fresh out of the box. As the big tank moves off, a German NCO begins to shout noisily at it. What he doesn't know is that in about a week's time, he'll be made responsible for the whole incident by the watchdogs and hung from a lamppost with a sign that reads, "Executed for gross negligence of regulations and lack of regard for security." German soldiers stare in confusion as the big vehicle of war begins to swing its turret towards the trench. Some begin to run as they understand that something is wrong. while others think that they are getting ready for a new attack. "How do I know what type of shell I'm using?" wonders Angus. "Who cares?" says the Welshman. "They all do damage. Just shout when one's in the chamber." Angus loads a shell into the explosive of the 88mm gun. Little does he know, what they are about to fire is a high explosive round, and they'll cause merry havoc. "Firing!" shouts Gruffen. The high explosive shell hits a grenade depot and blows a huge hole in the ground. "Loaded," says Angus, closing the giant breech of the gun. Gruffen eyes up a staff car about to leave and fires. The expensive car goes up into the air and never seems to come down. It is later found impaled on top of a huge fir tree, or at least the twisted chassis is. "Panzer coming up our arse," announces Stanley. Cormack turns the Tiger 1 around on the spot and barrels towards the Panzer. The crew of the Panzer panic and veer off into the trench, crushing an NCO and a man with a bazooka. "Firing!" shouts the Welshman. A belch of flame from the Tiger 1's barrel ends in the destruction of a Panzer IV. The crew don't even know that they are dead. The Irishman steers the monstrous tank towards a panther that is coming up a knoll on their left side. The Tiger 1 clips the side of the panther and breaks one of its tracks. The Tiger bounds down the hill and shatters a block of latrines. "Where on God's green earth are you bloody driving us, you bloody hot pot?" Stanley shouts at Cormack. The tank barrels its way through a wall and crushes a field kitchen, sending soup and bread rolls everywhere. "Loaded," says Angus. Gruffen lines up on a lorry driving up a muddy road and shouts, "Firing!" The shell goes straight through the lorry and it rolls to a halt. The driver jumps out in shock and stares in amazement at the giant hole that has appeared in the engine. "Never seen anything like that before," declares Gruffen. The Welshman lines up on a small house, out of which comes an officer and his assistants, who are carrying machine guns. The shell explodes in the house, showering the area with bricks, mortar, tiles, and ruined floral print carpet. "Head us back to the trench," Gruffen calls down to Cormack. The tank strains and wheezes as it lurches left towards the trench. "What's the plan?" shouts Angus over the roar of the engine. "We go from one end of the trench to the other and back again, with one track in and one track out," replies the Welshman. "You're mental," says Stanley. Cormack steers the heavy tank into the trench and crushes the SS unit that has just arrived. Their shining helmets are squashed like tin cans underfoot. The tank ploughs through troops and supplies until it reaches the end of the trench, at which point Cormack spins the tank around and begins to travel back along the trench. As they approach where they started, they see a group of terrified German soldiers armed with bazookas preparing to fire on the rogue tank. Angus loads a round into the big gun and the Welshman fires, sending the men with the bazookas up in an inferno of flame. "Prepare to bail out," says the Welshman. Cormack smashes the tank into a wall and the four men jump out of the vehicle. "Run for it," says Stanley, "and sing out Rule Britannia as loud as you bloody can. We'll be shot by our own lads." "Throw your grenades as you run," says the Welshman. As the four brave men run for their own lines, over their shoulders they throw the grenades, leaving a path of destruction. They jump into a trench, singing loudly, and tell its occupant to get a cup of tea ready. The Major soon made his way to where the four friends were resting, and listened as they told him how they had caused havoc in the German lines. "I just have one question," says the Major. "Why didn't you bring back the Tiger 1? You know the top brass have wanted to get their mitts on one of them for ages. You must have mud between your ears, says Stanley. Do you know what would happen if we come rolling along in a bloody jerry tank? I'll tell you, our own lads would have let loose with a great big bloody anti-tank gun. No, there's no way in hell that we would have made it back here alive otherwise. Suppose you're right, replies the Major. I've been told to give you a warm handshake for your bravery, and to give you 3 days' leave behind the lines. Marvellous, says the Irishman. The 4 men found out when the next supplies lorry was going back towards the village that the lines were in front of, and made good of their 3 days' leave. Where to first then? Asks Stanley. Shall we go to the pub or take a gander down at the ladies' rooms? I.e. a brothel. I know Rosie's been looking for me. Let's go down to the pub first, says Angus. The woman who runs the ladies' room is too much of a contrast with the girls there. The pub is almost full to capacity when they get there, and in order to get to the bar, have to physically move people. 4 beers, please, says the Irishman to the barman. Niet, says the barman. I will not serve you. Why? Asks Stanley, frowning. You come in here and thinks drinks free, explains the barman. I tell them to pay. They say piss off and leave. Gruffen pulls roubles from his pocket and sets them down on the counter and pushes it towards the barman. The barman takes the money and puts it in his pocket. He then fills 4 large glasses with beer and sets them down in front of the customers. The Welshman gives a nod of appreciation and takes his beer. The 4 men take their beers and move over to a table, knocking the drunk occupants out of the chairs onto the floor. Well, that was odd, says the Irishman. I've always paid for my drinks, says Angus. I've never made a mistake of getting on the barman's bad side. Must be a group of self-important nutters, comments Stanley. They're here, says the Welshman. A group of loud, laughing soldiers enters the pub and goes up to the bar. They're all talking at the same time, and the sound is awful. The 4 friends watch as the barman crosses his big arms and denies them drinks. You can pay for the drink that you had last time, and then you can leave, says the barman. We're saving your shit heap of a village from being burned off of the face of the earth, chum, retorts a greasy sergeant. Now give us our drinks, and we'll forget this little argument, eh? Niet, says the barman, who pulls out a shotgun from beneath the counter. One of the privates behind the sergeant pulls out a pistol and points it at the barman's head. Give us our fucking drinks, you Russian peasant, or Clyde'll pop you a cork, says the greasy sergeant. While this incident has been progressing, the 4 friends have made their way through the tense crowd of Russian villagers and taken up positions around the band of aggressive soldiers. Put the gun down, Gruffen says to Clyde. The greasy sergeant reels round and stares at the small man, who has a blank, unreadable expression on his face. Why should we do what you say? Says the sergeant. Angus, says Gruffen. The huge Scotsman grabs hold of Clyde's pistol and whips it out of his hand, drops it to the floor, and grabs the arm of his prey into both hands. Would you like to see why? Don't let him do it, wails Clyde. You don't have the balls to do it, says the sergeant to Gruffen. You're just a little man who should be down a mine along with the rest of your goblin-like people. The Welshman sniffs and wipes his nose. Angus, he says, break the cunt's arm. There is a sound of breaking bone and a scream of pain, and Clyde falls to the ground. A private in the group tries to make a break for the door, but is blocked by Stanley, who swiftly breaks his nose. You know, begins Gruffen, as Cormack brings a glass down on the head of a small engineer who is trying to pull his pistol from its holster. Goblins are meant to be quite nasty, and I feel insulted by what you have said to me. The sergeant takes a step back as the Welshman pulls out a knife and holds it with the ease of an expert. I was only joking, claims the sergeant. I'm not, though, says Gruffen, who knees the sergeant in the testicles and sends him sprawling onto the counter. I've been called every name under the sun, but Goblin, that's too much. The Welshman holds the sergeant's head on the counter and whispers into his ear. I could kill you now, and everyone here would say that I acted in self-defense. The barman would probably give us free drinks every time we came in here too. But I'm not a psychopath with a lust for blood. So, just to remind you of this day, I'm going to give you a little souvenir. The Welshman puts the tip of the knife to the sergeant's left cheek and cuts 3 lines deep into the soft skin. Fuck off now, says the Welshman, who pulls out a rag and begins to polish up his knife. As the sergeant makes his way to the door, Cormack grabs him by the shoulder and says, If you ever report this incident to your commander, and we get done for it, I will personally put a howitzer shell up your ass and leave a candle burning underneath it. The sergeant and his friends leave the pub without a word, save for the moans of Clyde. The barman puts 4 shot glasses of vodka on the counter for the friends and hands Gruffen back his money. The 4 men are clapped and patted in a friendly fashion by the locals and are cheered and waved to as they leave. Well, that was a nice thing we did, says Stanley as they walk down the road towards the ladies' room. When the 4 men get to the brothel, they are greeted by the owner of the establishment, a very short and fat woman with 8 silk scarves around her neck. She eyes them with the look of both contempt and admiration, a bizarre mix of feelings, but news of the pub incident has already spread across the small village. The 4 men are led inside and made comfortable by the scantily clad ladies. The Irishman asks for one of the girls in particular, and she comes excitedly out of the door and wraps herself around him. Angus chooses a dark-eyed woman with long hair down to the bottom of her buttocks. She has long, painted fingernails and is wearing only a small pair of thin knickers. The Welshman strikes up a conversation with a small blonde girl with bright green eyes and a jewel-encrusted hair clip. Stanley grabs a girl with an extremely heavy-looking bust and gives her a peck on the cheek. Soon the 4 men go into different rooms and let loose their animal feelings of the intimate variety. After a while they exit the rooms and pay the owner of the brothel. They walk off towards the inn and get rooms for free. The owner is the barman's brother. Each of them know that they will have to go back to the front lines soon, but are happy that they have 2 more days to relax. Gruffen rolled down a steep hill and found himself in the company of Angus. How's it going up there? Asks the Scotsman. Terrible, replies the Welshman. Perkins got blown up by a shell. He's scattered all over the place. Someone stepped on a mine right behind me, and I went flying into a hole. Next thing you know, there's a German in there with me. I very nearly didn't shoot him in time. He had the muzzle of his gun into my guts. Then I shot him through the head. Then I ran along and dropped a couple of grenades in an MG nest and rolled down here. You Welshmen are tougher than I thought, says the Scotsman. What have you been up to then? Asks the Welshman. I blew up one of those panzers the Jerrys have, says Angus. Stanley's coming down, says Gruffen. It's a bloody war zone out there, says Stanley when he reaches his friends. My mother would have a fit if she ever saw the mess we've made. Angus hands cigarettes round, and they begin to talk quietly about how they think this battle will finish. Where's Cormack? Angus asks out of the blue. I'm sitting right behind you, replies the Irishman. Why didn't you say anything? Asks Gruffen, looking behind Angus's broad back. I was enjoying the sound of you talking, replies the Irishman. It was like listening to the radio. A big shell explodes 30 feet from where the 4 men are sitting. We should move on, says Stanley. They move with the skills of a wolf and and they quickly make their way to an MG nest that the Germans had jury-rigged in a shell hole. "This is a nice setup," says Cormac, once the nest has been cleared of its previous occupants. Angus manoeuvres the heavy German machine gun into a direction that will take the enemy advance by complete surprise. Stanley feeds the belt through the machine gun as it mows down a group of savage-looking SS men. After the heavy machine gun has fired its last bullet, they move on and find themselves in a ridge alongside their friend, the Major. "What's our move then?" asks Cormac. "The General wants us to take the hill," replies the Major. "The Germans have only encompassed the base of it, and from what I've heard, they're nearly done for." "That might be true," says Stanley, "but they don't half kick when you grab 'em by the tail." "I suggest that we take their nearest trench and make sure that they can't get a hold again," says the Major. The four men follow the Major into the battlefield and are nearly cut down halfway to the Germans' trench. The Germans are extremely surprised to see the small group of British soldiers jumping into their trench, who proceed to cut them down and hunt out any others waiting to ambush them. "That was easy," says Cormac. "If we can keep it in our hands, then this hill should be easy to take," replies the Major. "Look what I found," says Stanley, picking something up off of the ground. "Jerry binoculars. Marvellous." "Major," calls Angus, "I found a dugout. Looks like the command centre for the trench." "Anyone in there?" asks the Major, tightening his grip on the rifle he's holding. "Aye, a Jerry officer with an iron cross down his throat. I've tied him up." "Good work, Angus," says the Major. "Gruffen, Stanley, go and see if he speaks English. The rest of us will set up a machine gun post and wait for the rest of the lads to catch up." Gruffen and Stanley make their way to the command dugout and find the officer that Angus has caught, tied to a chair and gagged with a dirty rag. "Hello, sunshine. Great day for the worm marsh, isn't it?" says Stanley in a friendly fashion. The German officer looks at the men with contempt in his eyes. "Who do the filthy Unterschmidt think they're talking to?" he thinks. "Pull the rag out of his mouth," says Gruffen. "God knows where it's been." "There you go, Jerry, how's that?" says Stanley to the officer as he pulls out the rag. The German officer spits nastily into the Englishman's face and cries out, "Heil Hitler!" "That wasn't very friendly," says Stanley to Gruffen. "There I am, relieving his mouth of a horrible rag that's probably been up someone's arse, and he spits in my face." "Do you speak English?" Gruffen asks the officer. "Ja," replies the officer. "As soon as the general hears about this, you will pay dearly for your actions. He is my uncle." "I don't care if he was Hitler himself," says Gruffen. "If you don't cooperate, one of us is going to cut your balls off and push them so far down your throat that they'll hang out of your ass, and you'll think they're hemorrhoids." "You wouldn't dare," says the officer. "Your own commander would have you shot without thinking twice about it." "Stanley," says Gruffen to his comrade. Stanley pulls out a sharp bayonet and moves towards the officer. "Which one would you prefer to go first?" asks the Englishman. "What are you talking about?" the German officer asks with a nervous laugh and fear in his eyes. "Which testicle?" asks Stanley. The Englishman undoes the officer's belt and pulls his trousers down round his ankles. "I used to work in an abattoir a few years before your lot got on their high horse," explains Stanley in a conversational tone that seems quite ill-fitted for the horrors that surround them. "The bloke who taught me how to do it told me that it was extremely important to get round to cutting off the bits on the outside of a carcass. Ears, tails, testicles, even eyes. Well, I learned how to do it and could have that bit of the job done in about a minute. Well, the bloke who taught me how to do it, he was extremely happy. to have been such a good teacher. I was only on the job for about 2 years. Then I heard about a job near Coventry that paid double, and I departed from that place. Turns out that the bloke who taught me had a few relatives in Germany, and he got wind that they's been murdered by some SS troops. He wrote me a letter about a month and a half ago, asking me to make sure that I shot every SS soldier I could. He would have himself, if he hadn't have had a heart condition and was too old to join up, although he did try. But I am not SS, says the officer. That's true enough, replies Stanley, but I thought you'd like to know how I learned to do what I'm about to do. I'll tell you anything, screamed the officer, as Stanley's knife just touched his tender skin. Good job, says Gruffen to Stanley. What's going on in here? Asks the Major. A German officer here was just saying as to how he'd like to chat about anything you'd care to talk about that happens to relate to the war, Major, returns Stanley. Why are his trousers down? Asks the Major, crossing his arms. He wanted to show us a mole on his leg, says Gruffen in a matter-of-fact tone. I see, says the Major dubiously. Shall we go outside, Major? Asks Stanley. Yes, says the Major. Angus is no doubt wondering if you've found something in here to nibble on. You haven't found anything, I'm afraid, Major, says Gruffen. Why don't you take that with you? Says the Major, pointing at a plate on a table with a big piece of roasted pork sitting on it. Cheers, Major, says Gruffen, picking up the plate. The two men leave the dugout with the food and make their way to their comrades. Ah, I see you found yourself a better dinner, says Angus, eyeing up the pork as they crouch down beside him. Help yourself, says Stanley, holding out the plate. Where's Cormack? Asks Gruffen. I think he went off to take a piss, replies Angus. A potato masher grenade suddenly drops to the ground in front of them. Angus is closest to it and picks it up in his hand. Stay the bloody grenade, you stupid Sassenach! Cries out Stanley, curling into a ball. The Scotsman throws the grenade and it explodes in mid-air. Who threw it? Says Gruffen, peeking over the top of the trench, where they have set up a captured heavy machine gun. Gruffen pulls out his service pistol and shoots in a direction. Got him, he says. Where was he? Asks Angus. He was running off to a shell hole, says Gruffen. Pass us a bit of that pork, will you? Says the Irishman upon his return. Where were you? Asks Stanley. I went for a piss and had a snoop around, replies Cormack. Find anything good? Asks Gruffen. I found a load of these, says Cormack, pulling out tins from his pockets. I think the Germans called them iron rations. We can keep them for a rainy day, says Angus, pushing them into a backpack. What are you lot doing? Asks an unfamiliar voice. The four men turn round and see an English sergeant without even a speck of mud on his crisp uniform. We're having our dinner, says Gruffen, pointing at the pork. I'll have to confiscate that, says the sergeant, bending down to take the plate. You must surely know that this sort of thing isn't allowed. It's looting. 4 rifles point at the sergeant's chest, and he backs away. I can have you court-martialed for this, he says with a raging red face. Who's your commander? I am, says the Major, putting a hand on the sergeant's shoulder. I do believe that you are disturbing my men's meal. The sergeant salutes the Major and says, Sir, I must report to you that these men have threatened my life, and I must arrest them on the charge of looting. I don't follow you, says the Major. The pork, sir. They must have found it, says the sergeant. But my good man, replies the Major, I helped them roast that pork. It's been in Angus's backpack ever since. Sir? Says the sergeant confusedly. Go away and do something useful, says the Major. You're annoying me. The sergeant leaves the men and disappears round the bend of the trench. I hate sergeants, says Gruffen. Just be careful that you don't become like that if you get promoted, says the Major. The 5 men tuck into a hearty meal while the battle slowly stops raging around them. Who authorized this? Says a shrill voice angrily. A lieutenant colonel has snuck down into the trench. He is notorious for finding fault in troops and having them punished. His nickname is Grasser. Fuck off, why don't you? Says Stanley. How dare you? Says the Grasser. Major, you were witness to that remark. I order you to arrest him this instant. I didn't hear him say anything, sir, replies the Major. Are you deaf, man? Says the Grasser in disbelief. Who authorized this arrest? I did, sir. They've been working hard all day, and we rolled up this trench about 40 minutes ago. So I ordered a break, replies the Major. The great king would be ashamed to see this, says the lieutenant colonel. I don't give a monkey's balls about a king, says Stanley, picking his teeth. If he's so bloody great, why don't he come here? Major, that private has just slandered the king. What are you going to do about it? Says the snitch. I don't know what you're talking about, sir, replies the Major. I'm afraid I can't hear anything at the moment. Through my right ear, a shell landed close to me a short time ago, and I'm afraid I haven't regained my hearing yet. The snitch stamps his boot into the ground and storms off. We should get moving, says Gruffen. I can smell trouble. That was me, says Cormack. I just farted. The 5 men leave their position and move over the back of the trench as other British forces take their place. A little later on, when the hill has been secured, Gruffen asks the Major what the German officer told him. Well, Gruffen, he told me some mad story about Stanley threatening to cut his balls off, and that you instigated it. Of course, I know that he was talking a load of rubbish. I know you too well. You'd never do that to anyone. He also told me where the German forces' fallback positions are, but I'm not allowed to tell anyone but the General himself about that. Of course, Major, replies Gruffen. Of course. Lads, I'm afraid that I've been called back to HQ. I'll be gone for at least 3 days. Something about moving forward, said the Major. You're going to miss the boxing match on Tuesday then, said Stanley. Sure you can't delay the trip? Afraid not, replies the Major. But don't worry, I've already placed my bet on Jenkins. I'm sure he'll win. He'll have to tell me all about the nitty-gritty details when I get back. Who's in charge while you're gone? Asks Angus. I did nominate Gruffen, replies the Major, but unfortunately he hasn't got the rank for it. He's got the experience for it though, hasn't he? Says Cormack. That might be true, replies the Major, but that's not what the bosses think. Who's in charge then? Asks Stanley. An American, replies the Major. Colonel Anderson? Be careful around him. He's a right bastard when it comes to grunts. He treats them like slaves. We'll be careful, says Gruffen. The Major leaves in an armoured car and heads off towards HQ. The 4 men hope and pray with all of their hearts that the Germans don't spot him and blow him up. Their thoughts are rudely interrupted. What the hell is going on here? Asks a hard American voice. We're on break, replies Stanley. Break? Don't you guys know that there's a war on? Oh, we know all right, replies Stanley. We've been fighting it for ages. Now, do us a favour and sod off. Don't you know who I am? Asks the American angrily. No, replies Stanley. I don't know you, and I don't want to. Now, go back to your dugout before I drag you there myself. I am a colonel in the American Army, and I've been put in charge of you and this section. I'm going to work you boys to the bone now. What are you going to make us do? Questions Angus, stretching his big brawny arms. Wipe your ass. On your feet now, screams the colonel. Nobody moves. Gruffen pulls out his Bible and begins to read a prayer. Stanley begins to doze off. Cormack picks his nails with a bayonet, and Angus chews on a piece of stale bread. The colonel storms off and reports the 4 men to his commander, Brigadier Higgins. They refuse to obey orders, explains the colonel. I must request that you court-martial them immediately. The brigadier sits back in his chair. He still owes £50 to Angus, who sold him a box of Cuban cigars and a case of French cognac. He also knows that they are valuable. Hated, but valuable. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to help you. They're experts in the field of battle. Just last week they and the Major rolled up a German trench by themselves. But they're refusing orders and lounging around like alley cats, retorts Colonel Anderson. I know, replies the Brigadier, but they are looked upon with favour from the top brass. They don't like them all that much when they have to talk to them, but they are held high, true example to the men. I'm going to have to report you to HQ, says the Colonel. They won't be happy about the way you've handled my complaint. Do what you want, Colonel Anderson, says the Brigadier. I truly don't care, and neither will they. Colonel Anderson stomps out of Brigadier Higgins' office and heads back to the four-men's shelter, picking up a machine gun on the way. When the Colonel arrives, he finds that they have disappeared. A gravel-faced soldier saunters past the Colonel and is quickly accosted. What's your name, soldier? Billy. Why? Replies the soldier. Damn you, says the Colonel. Is there no discipline in this section? No, replies the soldier. Obviously not. It was rhetorical, yells the Colonel. Rhetoric what? Says Billy. Great, you're illiterate as well, says Colonel Anderson. Fuck off, you cunt, says Billy, turning his back on the Colonel. What did you say to me, grunt? Sorry, says Billy, turning back round and smartly saluting. Fuck off, you cunt, sir. I'll have your goddamn head, says the Colonel. Yeah, that's right, says Billy, turning round and walking off with his hands in his pockets. The Colonel runs through the dugouts and machine gun nests and finds the four men he's looking for. He turns the gun on them and says, You're going to do exactly as I say. We're busy, says Cormack. Colonel Anderson suddenly realises that he has just interrupted the unloading of a supplies lorry carrying grenades. How long are you going to be? Demands the Colonel. I don't know, replies Cormack, handing down a numbered box of grenades. I'm not a clock. The Colonel waits half an hour while the four men unload the crates and boxes from the supplies vehicle, telling jokes and laughing to each other. Right, says Colonel Anderson. You're going to follow me and we're going to practice. Practice what? Asks Gruffen. We'll start with parade, then a 3-mile run, and then... The Colonel is interrupted by a harsh laugh behind him. He turns and sees Billy bent double with laughter. What are you laughing at? Growls Colonel Anderson. You, says Billy, calming down. What's your rank? Says Colonel Anderson. I don't know, says the soldier. I skipped the classes that told me what the different ranks were. Well, what's your name? I already told you, replies Billy. Are you stupid or something? We all refer to him as Billy from Fazakerley, explains Stanley. Where the hell is that? Says the Colonel. Yorkshire? Liverpool, you fucking cabbage, says Billy. You know where Britain's biggest port is. That explains the accent, says the Colonel. What did you say? Questions Billy. What's wrong with my accent? Nothing. Now get out of my sight, orders Colonel Anderson. No, says Billy. I asked you a fucking question. What's wrong with my accent? You sound like you've got a cold. I feel like I'm covered in phlegm. Uh-oh, says Angus. You'll be hearing from me, says Billy. As Billy leaves, Cormack turns to the Colonel. I'd apologise to him if I were you. Why would I do that? Says Colonel Anderson arrogantly. 'Cause otherwise that next parcel that you get from your dear old mother is going to blow up, replies Stanley. Are you threatening me? said the Colonel, "because I could shoot you here and now." "No," replied Stanley, "I didn't. But just remember, the post comes on Tuesday." "He wouldn't dare," stated the Colonel. "He would," replies Gruffen. "I don't believe you. Next thing you'll tell me is that he's part of a crime gang." "Now why would we tell you that," replies Cormack, "when you'll find out for yourself?" The Colonel begins to shake with rage, but Gruffen saw in his eyes the twinkling of fear. "We've got criminals back home," says the Colonel. "You English aren't criminal. I've never heard of any criminals before." "He's not English though," replies Cormack. "He's from Liverpool. It's like a different country." The Colonel dropped his machine gun and bounded in the direction that Billy had gone.
"Wait till the Major hears about this,"
says Angus with a laugh. When the Major returned, he was met by his 4 comrades and handed his winnings. "Was it a good show?" asks the Major. "Aye," replies Angus. "You were right. Jenkins won fair and square." "I see," says the Major. "How did everyone fare with the Colonel?" "He's currently on his way to another section," says Cormack. "Oh, did he get hurt?" asks the Major. "No," replies Gruffen. "He just didn't find us that welcoming." "Don't tell me anything," says the Major. "At least not till I'm out of my mind drunk."
"Major, I want these men's heads,"
said the General.
"With all due respect, sir, they are our best team, and they refuse to be separated. That even High Command would have them disposed of." "Is that right?" replied the General, with a leer. "You mean to say that despite the fact that they refuse to obey the commands of officers of a higher rank, they send a colonel mad with fear, and that they regularly play pranks on my staff, that High Command, British High Command, will not get rid of them?" "Yes, sir," replied the Major. "But they will take commands." "Oh, really?" said the General. "And tell me, whose orders do they obey? Because it's obvious that they don't like Americans telling them what to do." "They take my orders, sir," replied the Major. "Yours?" cried the General. "Are you out of your mind? I've heard them call my cousin, Sergeant Whitley, a cunt behind his back. I heard them call me the same name when I was only 2 goddamn feet from them. And you're telling me that they do what you say? Why?" "I have a special relationship with them, sir," replies the Major. The General stood up from his chair and paced about, red in the face. "Okay," said the General. "I am going to inspect the men tomorrow, and I expect your lot to be there. I'll ask Brigadier Higgins to give them the order, and when he comes and tells me that they've disobeyed orders, then I'll send you, and if they follow your orders, then I'll leave them alone, and they're all yours." "Very good, sir," replies the Major. "I can't see why they don't like the American army," the Major thinks to himself. "They seem so arrogant." "I'll be sending Sergeant Whitley with you as well. I want to hear what they have to say," says the General. "You are dismissed." The Major salutes and leaves without a word. Brigadier Higgins is sent to give the orders from the American General and finds himself rebuked. Sergeant Whitley arrives to collect the Major and snitch on anything that they say. Whitley is 5 feet and 7 inches tall, has a number of pimples on his face, and is known for being the snitch of the army. So much so that both the American and British forces call him it behind his back. The Major works his way to his 4 friends. If they do as he asks, then everything will fall into place. If not, then they are well and truly in trouble. Gruffen sees them first. "Look out, everyone, the snitch is with the Major, and he doesn't look happy to have him along." "Hello, lads," greets the Major with a slightly forced smile. "Cup of tea," says Stanley, holding out a filthy cup with the hot beverage in it. "Thanks," returns the Major, taking the cup by the handle and taking a sip. He can taste the whiskey, and it feels good. "The General has given orders for an inspection of the men tomorrow."
I know Higgins has been here before me, but I must stress to you how important it is." "We'll be there," replies Cormac. "We wouldn't want to disobey orders." "That's the spirit," replies the Major. "Don't forget to polish your shoes and your guns. I'll send a man round with polish. You'd make Churchill proud," says the snitch haughtily, and with an air of approval. "Are you joking?" says Stanley, with a smile on his face. "Churchill is a fat old tard with no idea of what's going on." The snitch turns on his heel and begins to walk away.
"Oi!" cries out Angus. "You weren't told you could leave?" "Permission to leave, sir?" asks the snitch. "Denied," replies the Major, giving Gruffen a smile. "There's a few things that I want you to do." "But, sir," says the snitch before being interrupted. "You wouldn't be arguing with the Major, would you?" says Gruffen. The snitch goes quiet and waits. "I want you to run along to the supplies commander and ask for some cloths and polish. Then I want you to find me a new pistol for Private Gruffen, as he was separated from his whilst fighting off a German attack the other day." "Yes, sir," replies Whitley. "As soon as I report it to the General, I'll begin." "No," says the Major. "I've given you instructions. You'll follow them first, or I'll report you and have you demoted to private." The snitch salutes and leaves quickly. "What was all that about?" asks Cormac. "The General wants to know whether or not you follow orders or not," replies the Major. "I explained to him that you only follow my orders because we have a special relationship." "We'll be at the inspection," says Gruffen. The Major leaves and the four friends begin to fix holes in their uniforms as best as they can. The snitch arrives with the boot polish, cloths and pistol, and leaves promptly. The next day, all of the men are standing in line for the General's inspection. The American General arrives in his jeep and scowls at the men as he puffs on his cigar. He recently lost a case of cigars in transit and is fuming because of it. When he reaches the four friends, he looks hard into their impassive faces and finds that they are correct and in a suitable condition. The General looks at the Major, who gives a kindly smile. "When the fuck is this over?" someone says from the line of men. "Who said that?" yells the General, staring at the long line of men. "I did," replies a gravel-faced soldier, stepping forward. "I need a shit, and I've been holding in for 15 bloody minutes. We've been waiting for you to punch around." "Somebody seize that man!" demands the General. Nobody moves. No one wants to make a mistake with the gravel-faced soldier. "Somebody do something," says the General. The gravel-faced soldier pulls down his trousers, pulls a wad of newspaper from his pocket, squats down, and releases the contents of his bowels. The General is shocked into silence. "What's your name, soldier?" he finally asks. "Billy," replies the gravel-faced soldier. "You can consider yourself dead," says the General. "When High Command hears about this, they'll do nothing," says Billy, standing back into his place. The General leaves silently. "At ease, everyone," the Major orders, staring hard at the defecate on the ground, trying to work out if the situation is a dream. "Nothing'll happen," Billy says. "I've done worse. I've got a mate in High Command who'll deal with it anyway." The General in his car is still in shock. He cannot believe that a lowly private had the balls to defecate before him, and when asked his name simply replied, "Billy." When High Command hears the report, several of the staff members begin to laugh loudly. They have no intention of doing anything to resolve the situation. That particular unit is known for its antics. The General nearly dies of a heart attack when he finds out Billy is the one that delivers his mail. 3 days pass before the friends find out that the General has decided not to think about their unit ever again and let his staff
run their show. "Billy was right," the Major says to Gruffen while they eat their meals. "Nothing did happen. I can't believe it." "No," says the Major, "but I might just procure a bottle of it, to keep my hip flask full, of course." Everybody smiles and agrees with the Major.
"Here," said Stanley. "What are we doing driving a big old van like this for?"
"Because we've got to get these rifles back to our lines," replied Gruffen, lighting a cigarette. "We're not going to be able to beat back Jerry without any guns, are we?"
"Any twit with an ounce of stuffing in his head knows that," says Stanley. "Why don't we stop off at the inn, up the road a ways?"
"Why?" asks Gruffen. "We've got to be there by 5:15. Then we have to unload them."
"Well, I'm hungry and I'm thirsty, and I'd appreciate it if we stopped for a meal."
"Fine," says Gruffen with a smile. "I'm parched myself." Gruffen pulled the big army vehicle over in front of a small inn called La Poule Tordue, or in English, the Crooked Hen. The two men went into the inn and ordered some pie and carrots with a glass of beer. The pub was entirely made from wood. There was straw on the floor and an old man playing a slightly out-of-tune piano. There were several other people in the inn. A man who had passed out and was lying on the floor with his beagle, a heavy woman was lying draped over a table, and a few British and American troops were playing a game of cards. The pie was dished out on battered tin plates, and the beer was served in watermarked glasses.
"Did you hear about Andrews this morning?"
Stanley asked Gruffen.
"Which one?"
says Gruffen. "The one in the mobile canteen or the one that snivels up to Brigadier Higgins?"
"The one that works for Higgins," replies Stanley. "He got drunk last night and went around saying that he'd never have to fight because he was a member of his staff."
"But surely he knows that isn't true," says Gruffen. "He would have had to give Higgins the best blowjob on earth to stay behind. And Higgins isn't that way, if you know what I mean."
"Yeah, I've seen the Brigadier in the typing pool's supply cupboard giving Susie one," replies Stanley. "Don't ask me how."
"Andrews must have lost his mind then," says Gruffen, finishing off his pie and carrots. "What was that I heard?" said a familiar voice.
"Fuck off, Andrews," says Stanley. "You're bloody cracked."
"How dare you!" exclaimed Andrews. "I'm a lieutenant, you private."
"I think you're fired at your captain," replies Stanley.
"Captain Shithead. Got it?" "I'll have you in front of a firing squad. Higgins will hear about this."
"Tell Higgins whatever you want," says Stanley. "You're still fighting with us whether you like it or not."
"Not likely," replies Andrews. "My cousin in the General's staff is sorting out a transfer for me. I'm leaving in 3 days or so." "What's your cousin called?" asked Gruffen. "Philip Flo," replied Andrews with a smug look on his face. Andrew was tall, thin and shrew-faced. His hands were abnormally long and his eyes were much too small for his face. He was immaculately dressed, with a crease in his trousers so sharp that you could cut paper with them. "You'll never leave us," said Gruffen. "You seem sure of that," said Andrews. "That's because I have connections that you could only dream of," replies Gruffen. "You maggot," says Andrews, laying a punch into Gruffen's chest. Gruffen barely acknowledges the blow and simply stands up, sending Andrews a dangerous look.
"I'd run if I were you,"
says Stanley with a smile. "Nonsense," says Andrews, just seconds before a large, gnarly fist hits him in the guts.
"Give him the old doings in," says Stanley, taking a swig of his beer.
Gruffen was a miner, and has gained strength and resilience because of it. Andrews sees the hail of blows coming at him in slow motion. He feels teeth break, muscles knot from lack of any form of use. "You sit in your office "Writing down notes for the Brigadier, thinking you're better than the rest of us," says Gruffen, punching Andrews hard in the chest. "I like the Brigadier. He at least has had his face in the dirt. But you need to learn." Andrews lands unconscious on the floor next to the drunk and his dog. The beagle barks and bites savagely at Andrews' ear. Andrews woke with a yelp and crawled quickly out of the inn. Gruffen returned to his table and drank his beer. "Nice one," says Stanley. The two men finish their beers and leave the inn in good spirits. "Where do you think he went?" Stanley asks Gruffen, looking around as they get into their van. "I'm right here," says Andrews, jumping in front of the vehicle with a rifle in his hand. "I'll send you into a permanent foxhole." "At least he knows the terminology," says Gruffen. "You idiot!" shouts Stanley, leaning out of the window. "That thing isn't loaded. You haven't put a bloody magazine in it." Andrew's face went pale as Gruffen revved the engine and slowly rolled towards him. Stanley jumped out of the van and hit Andrews around the back of the head and tied him up. "I'm going to need a story for this one," says Gruffen, after Stanley has stuffed Andrews into the back of the van. "I've got it sorted," says Stanley with a wink. As soon as the two men's van pulled up, Andrews, loose of his bonds, jumped from the back and bolted off in the direction of Brigadier Higgins' office. Gruffen and Stanley were soon summoned to Higgins' office, and they grinned as they entered. "What's all this I hear about you two beating up my staff member, Andrews?" "Well, speak up," says the Brigadier. "It was like this," begins Stanley. "We went into an inn and had a meal on our way back. We were running early, so we thought we'd stop off. Well, we was talking about the gossip we'd heard about certain people, and Andrews just happened to be one of those people. Well, he overheard us, which is okay, if you don't act rude, and started mouthing off, which is what he did. We tried to be friendly and polite, but next thing you know, he punches Gruffen in the chest. Well, Gruffen taught him his lesson and sent him running, and we thought that the matter was done with. Until that is when we left. Well, Andrews had opened up one of the cases in the back and pinched one of the rifles. We were lucky that he hadn't put a magazine in it. Well, when we politely pointed this out to him, it must have been too much for him, because the next thing you know, he's passed out on the floor. I put him in the back of the van and off we went." The Brigadier had a big beaming smile on his face. "What exactly was the gossip that you were talking about?" he asked. "Well," said Stanley, "just the usual really, when things were arriving, news from back home, and that Andrews thought he was the toughest one out of the whole section." "That's not true," said the whining voice of Andrews from the dark corner of the room. "Be quiet," said Higgins. "These men are giving their report. Carry on." "I heard that Andrews had developed this belief that he could best any soldier in combat," continued Stanley, suppressing a smile. "You know, like the bayonet, snipping, stuff like that. Well, I don't know how much truth is in it, but that's what I'd heard." "I see," says the Brigadier. "Gruffen, you've been awfully quiet. Do you care to add anything?" "Andrews is a relative in the General's staff," says Gruffen. "I heard that he was trying to get him out of the area so that he didn't get killed. In fact, I heard it from Andrews himself. He also said that he would be extremely upset if the order came through for him to go further behind the lines, as he felt that he would be of more use here." "It's all lies," yelled out Andrews. "They know it's not true. My cousin is trying to get me out of here because I don't want to fight." Andrews had well and truly put his foot in it. "So," said the Brigadier, "you're trying to escape your duty, are you?" "No, sir," said Andrews, pale in the face. "It came out wrong." "On the contrary," says Higgins, "I think that you spoke the truth. I'm glad that you have. You are, of this moment, no longer a member of my staff. And furthermore, You were demoted to private. You were lucky I don't have you court-martialed for this rather elaborate attempt at desertion."
"But, sir," cried Andrews with tears in his eyes, "I don't want to fight. I'm not brave enough." "You seem brave enough to try and kill 2 men with a rifle," says the brigadier. "Now get out." Andrews gave Gruffen and Stanley a hateful stare as he left the room. "I hate that man," says the brigadier. "You always put sugar in my tea." "It's a sin in itself. I've been looking for an excuse to get rid of him," says the brigadier. "Thank you. You can have the rest of the day off." "Thanks, Higgins," says Stanley. The 2 friends leave Higgins' office to meet up with their other friends. As they're walking towards their big dugout, an explosion throws them off of their feet and sends them sprawling into the wet mud, adding another layer to their already crusty uniforms. The Major comes out of the dugout and looks around. Cormack and Angus soon follow. The Major comes out of the dugout and looks around. Cormack and Angus soon follow. Maniacal laughter is heard all over the area. "What's going on?" the Major asks Gruffen as he gets up. "It's Andrews, Major," says Gruffen. "He's lost it." "Which Andrews?" the Major asks. Within 2 minutes, the Major gets the key points of the incident relating to the inn, the fight, and the meeting with Brigadier Higgins. "I don't think he can cope," says Stanley. "He don't want to fight the bloody Germans because he's scared of getting hurt. But he'll try and kill us, won't he?" Another explosion echoes around the area. "He's throwing grenades," says Cormack. "He must be mad." "Andrews!" yells the Major. "Come down from wherever you're hiding this instant." A bullet narrowly misses the Major's head and pings off of an ammunition box behind him. "Angus," says the Major, "find that man and bring him to me. I'm going to enjoy giving him a good dressing down." Angus leaves the group with the agility of a cat hunting a mouse. "How long do you think it'll take him to find him?" Cormack asks after a few minutes. A loud, piercing shriek reverberates around the area. It sounds like a cross between a scared chicken and a fox crying out. "Not long," says the Major. Angus returns to the group with Andrews over his shoulder and a rifle in his left hand. "Where was he?" asks Gruffen. "He was helping himself to a pile of grenades that he'd emptied out of a box," the big Scotsman replies. "Take his clothes off," instructs the Major. The 4 men strip off Andrew's clothes and, under the Major's directions, bury him in an angled, shallow grave with his head sticking out. "What are we doing this for?" asks Stanley. "He needs to learn that the army is not for pansies," explains the Major. "He'll get a nasty shock when he wakes up. Now look solemn, everyone." Andrews woke up to find the 5 friends standing around him, looking very sad. "Such a shame," says Stanley. "I had hoped to make it up to him." "He didn't realise he'd pulled the pin out on the grenade," says Angus. "We'll have to send his parents a letter," says the Major. "They'll be upset, naturally." "I'm alive," says Andrews. "I'm right here. Hello?" "Can you hear something?" asks Cormack. "Just one of the vents starting up," says Stanley. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," says Gruffen, who is holding a Bible in one hand. "He left this world too soon. May his soul rest in peace." Andrew's mouth was open in horror. He believed that he had died. "Oh God," he says, "is this how death is? Is this what I'll have to endure? Is this purgatory? Oh God, please forgive me. I didn't want to go to war. I'm scared. Forgive me." "None of us wanted to go to war," says the Major, crouching down to Andrew's head. "But here we are, all because of some good-for-nothing in Germany, who thinks that he can take over the world." "You can see me?" says Andrews. "Of course we can see you, says the Major. I had to teach you a lesson, and I think you've learned it. But why am I buried? Asks Andrews confusedly. It's just to give you a shock, that's all, replied the Major. The five friends heave Andrews out of the ground and wipe the wet soil off of his body with old rags. Do you think that it'll be any more trouble to us? Asks Stanley, as Cormack leads the shaken man away. No, says the Major. He'll never speak of it to anyone. Where'd you learn that trick, anyway? Asks Gruffen. I learned it from a colonel, explains the Major. He asked me to help him do it when I first joined up. It was a horrible man who was as cowardly as anything, just like him. I'll have to remember that one, says Gruffen. Might come in handy one day. The friends went to their dugout and made up a cup of tea and scrounged up some bread and corned beef. He's asleep in his dugout, says Cormack when he arrives. Any idea what we're going to do next? Angus asks the Major. Yes, says the Major. We're going on a reconnaissance behind the Jerry lines. Great, says Stanley. Why don't we just shoot ourselves in the head? It's a bloody suicide mission. Again. I know, says the Major. I'll be coming with you. Gruffen, I'd like you to gather up 5 more men, experienced men. We'll need all the luck in the world to get there and back. Gruffen gives a nod and downs his tea before going off to find some men. Gruffen had the men lined up with a foot between them. The Major looked up and down the line and nodded. Who's here? The Major asked Gruffen. I'd like to know who I'm working with. We've got Angus, Cormack, Stanley and myself as usual, began Gruffen. Billy's here with us as well. He's got the camera. Lowe is with us. He's the medic. Cyril is with us. He's got the mapping equipment with him. Philip has got the food supplies. And Bevan Warren is carrying the spare magazines and grenades. Which one is he? Asked the Major. The big one at the end, replies Gruffen. Looks like he could knock a house down by leaning on it. Oh, yes, says the Major. I've seen him before. There's so many of us in the army that I lose track of the people in it. When do we set off for? Asks Cormack. Immediately, replies the Major. We're heading into their territory, which means that we'll have to be very vigilant, make sure that we don't get spotted, or we're for the high jump. The team set off, and using a map reference that had already been marked out, found a way through the German lines. They were to travel 4 miles and find out what the strength of the enemy was, where their strong points were, how many tanks and armoured vehicles there were, and of course to make sure where there could be minefields. Billy took photographs from the trees to shield the lens from detection. Cyril made marks on the various maps for emplacements and positions. He was very good at his task and would write down certain details next to the marks, such as ratios. Cormack had nearly broken his leg on the way there, and Lowe found a huge black bruise growing on the Irishman's shin. Gruffen and Stanley were playing cards, and Angus and Bevan were arm wrestling. Bevan was 6'4" tall, while Angus was 2 inches shorter, but they were both of equal strength and had been locked in their match for a good 10 minutes. The Major was busy passing rations around the men when he heard the unmistakable sound of Germans talking on patrol. "Everyone down," he said. Everyone hid in bushes and shrubs and waited for what was going to happen next. 5 German soldiers in dirty uniforms came through their area. They were evidently in good humour, for they were laughing and joking and not holding on to their guns properly. "Das grob nachen ich hatan zolich nat korsi konten fiken." Or the translation, from German to English, "That big girl I had last night, she could fuck," one of them said. When they had passed and had been gone for several minutes, the group of British men retook their positions and continued what they had been doing. Except for Gruffen and Stanley. They were now keeping watch.
Any ideas what those Jerrys were talking about? Stanley asked Gruffen. Sex, I think, replied Gruffen. I recognised a few words.
I didn't know you knew German,
said Stanley. I was going to go on a holiday there a few years ago, before they went completely nuts. I learned a few phrases so I could get around without much difficulty. That might come in useful one day, said Stanley. The team finished their survey and packed up, ready to head home, i.e. their lines. About 3 hours into their journey, they heard more Germans on patrol. Weapons ready, said the Major. Keep quiet and wait for them to pass. Everyone hid and waited, hoping that the Germans would just pass them by. The Germans came into their area and sat down on the logs that had been strewn around by loggers that had abandoned their work when the Germans had invaded. The Major saw the lightning bolt symbols first and realised that unless these SS men left soon, that they would have to kill them. Stanley was lying in a bush about 30 feet in front of the Major and also realised that these Germans were SS. The SS troops lit a fire and began preparing a meal. These Germans were going to stay where they were for at least an hour, and the Major was going to have to think fast. If any of his men were to sneeze, belch, flatulate, or talk, then they were all toast. The Major pulled out a whistle and thought hard about what he was about to do. If all went well, then as the Germans looked around and tried to find the source of the noise, the rest of the men would mow them down with machine gun fire. If it didn't go well, then they would all die a horrible death at the hands of the SS. The Major blew hard into his whistle, and a piercing, sharp sound echoed through the woods. The SS men jumped up with their machine guns and scowled at the woods, peering into the bushes. All of a sudden, the sound of a knife entering a body could be heard, followed by a shrill scream. Gruffen had thrown his knife expertly from his position and eliminated one of the SS. One German, rough-faced and with slitty eyes, poured a stream of bullets into the bushes to try and scare the British troops into revealing themselves. A yelp came from a big bush, and the Major watched the rough-faced SS man grin and walk over to it. A moment later, the Major watched the German's body fall to the ground as a huge hand grabbed him by the coat, followed by a harsh sound of bones snapping. There were now only 3 SS men left, and they looked around in confusion, unable to work out where their attackers were. The whole of the British team rose up from their positions and trained their weapons on the SS men. Stunned, the SS men surrendered and allowed themselves to be tied up. "We'll be heroes when we get back," says Cormack. "There are other SS patrols," snarled one of the Germans. "You will be caught." "From what I've heard," said the Major to the German, "your SS doesn't treat other Germans who've been captured very well. Don't they get executed for misconduct or some such thing?" "Correct," said the German SS man, "but I will be permitted to make my report first." "These Germans aren't exactly supermen, are they?" said Bevan, wiping blood off of his hand. "Was it you that got rid of that rough-faced fellow?" the Major asked. "Aye," replied the giant Cornishman. "It was easier than killing a fish with a priest." "What did you use?" asked the Major. "My fist, sir," replied the Cornishman. "You killed Otto?" said one of the Germans. "All these cunts know English," commented Stanley. "He was coming at me, so I dealt with him," explained Bevan. "There's someone coming," said Angus. "Definitely German." "You must have ears like a bat," said Cormac in admiration. "That's what my mother said," replied Angus. The 3 remaining Germans were gagged and blindfolded and held down by Angus and Bevan. The German patrol arrived and inspected the still blazing fire. These were ordinary military troops, soldiers forced to fight. The patrol carried on, and Angus signalled when they were out of range. "We need to get the fuck out of here," said Stanley, "or we'll be strung up." The group carried on their way for several hours and encountered no more threats, until they were half a mile away from their lines. 2 large tiger tanks were blocking the way. They were accompanied by teams of panzer grenadiers and a large group of infantry. "How do we get past that lot?" asked Cormack. "I don't know," replied the Major. "They could be stopping here for the night, or they could be stationed here until further orders, and the Germans don't really operate without orders." "I've got an idea," says Stanley. "These Jerrys have got to have a radio set to receive orders. What if we disabled their radios? That way they can't call in help. We can blow up their tanks with the grenades that Bevan's got in his pack. The confusion will be immense. While they're busy putting out the fires, we can rush through and carry on," explained Stanley. "It might work," said the Major. "Okay, we'll wait till night time. Then we'll do it. In the meantime, I'll find out where their radios are kept." The British group spread out and began hunting around for where the radios were kept. It was Cyril who discovered the tent with the radio set in it. "How do we cut the wires and leave them unrepairable?" said the Major, rubbing his forehead. "Easy," said Stanley. "We'll take them with us." "What do you mean?" asked the Major. "We'll cut a long length off of the cable and take it with us. You know, the one that powers it, and we'll fray the ends of it. Easy." "Who will you take with you?" asked the Major. "Angus," replied Stanley. The 2 men sneaked into the German camp when there was no one around, and quickly knocked out the radio operator. "It's lucky he was looking the other way," says Stanley. "Pass me the cutters," said Angus, tracing the power cable. The big Scotsman cut the cable and rolled it up into the shape of a ring. "We should fuck something else up too," said Stanley. "Like what?" asked Angus, looking around the room. "There's bound to be a generator around here somewhere," said Stanley. "How could we get to it?" asked Angus. "I can put on this Jerry's uniform," said Stanley. The German radio operator was soon undressed to his undergarments, and Stanley made his way around the German base, looking around for the generator. He found it tucked away between 2 giant crates, and quickly cut several wires connected to it. He also undid the fuel cap and poured in a handful of dry soil before leaving. Stanley made his way back to the radio tent and quickly changed back into his ordinary clothes. "How did it go?" asked the Major when they got back. "They are well and truly fucked," said Stanley. "Their radio's never going to work. Plus, I went and messed up their generator." "Brilliant," replied the Major. "That'll add to the confusion when we blow up their tanks. Good thinking." The British team and their prisoners, who had been expertly knocked out by Angus, waited in silence. Night came, and the Germans in the camp were trying vainly to get their generator working again. One of the tank drivers had just taken it apart and discovered a congealed lump of soil in it, when one of the tigers exploded into flames, followed by an even louder crash of sound as the ammunition brewed up within and tore the monster vehicle apart from the inside out. The second tiger quickly followed, and shrapnel flew everywhere. The turret lifted off and deposited itself 30 feet away. The large group ran through the mayhem undetected, and were greatly relieved to reach the other side of the camp, into the safety of large bushes. It took them 2 hours of carefully picking their way through the terrain of the woods in the dark, having to deal with the now awake and protesting SS men. The Brigadier was extremely pleased to receive the 3 SS men. "Well done," Higgins congratulated them. "No doubt the top brass will be very happy to have such wonderful company. They can learn how the SS work using this lot." All 10 of the men were given triple rations and bottles of beer. "I hope we don't ever have to go on one of them missions again," said Stanley to Billy over a card game. I don't think it's right to risk people's necks to find out where the tossers are and we've got to shoot to bits.
Yeah, first should do that,
said Billy. Yeah, agreed Stanley. They've got shed loads of planes, more than the fucking Luftwaffe, and they have good cameras.
You should send in a complaint,
said Billy. Can you imagine the hoo-ha that would cause? Replied Stanley. I'll just go ill next time. Say I've got pneumonia. Gargle some water in my throat.
I don't think that'll work,
said Billy. Why not? Asked Stanley. I've heard other people use that trick to get out of things.
Because the Major's standing behind you,
said Billy.
The Germans attacked hard. They were attempting to root out the British and American forces that were in the area and had been doing so for at least 3 days. Stanley walked over to a cafe that was still standing and serving people. It had been a rather hectic day. Twice a German sniper had tried to kill him, a Panzer IV had nearly run him down, and he nearly leaned on an exposed landmine. Other than these small things, life was good. The rest of his friends were waiting for him in the cafe at one of the 2 remaining tables. They had just ordered all of the teas when he arrived. "What's the news, Major?" asked Stanley. "Has Berlin fallen? Has the man with the tiny moustache given in and surrendered and said to the world, 'Mine friends, mine Germans, mine countrymen, Deutschland has fallen. We'll never be rulers of the world'? Sorry about that. Mind your step." The Major smiled and shook his head in amusement. If only what he said came to be. "The Brigadier has informed me that we are to attack the Jerrys and push them back. Of course, we will be going in first." "Typical," said Stanley, rolling his eyes and lighting a cigarette. "We're the dregs, the leftovers. We get sent in first because we survived, didn't we?" "Looks like it," said the Major. "We will round the hill, mark out on the map that they'll give us, and distract the Jerrys while the Churchills and Shermans move in, without getting bothered or annoyed." "What are they going to give us to use?" asked Cormack. "A whole company of men and some mortars, a few vans, and a little bit of air support?" "Very funny," commented the Major. "I wish it was the case. No, we will be going in alone, with very little. Just our machine guns, a handful of grenades, and, of course, our lives, which, of course, we mustn't lose." "That would be fatal," said Angus. "I wonder," said Stanley. "I might be able to get us a tank." "You must be mad," says Cormack. "Where would you be able to get a tank?" "What type of tank is it?" asked the Major interestedly. "Matilda Mark II, replied Stanley. "Lovely thing." "We'll get shot to pieces," says Gruffen. "If they have any of those Panzer Grenadiers with them, it'll be like squashing a fly with your finger."
"True," says the Major. "But don't forget, flies move very quickly, and we'd use that tank to zip in and out."
"They barely reach 15 miles per hour on a road," retorts Gruffen, "and it might as well be a pillbox without walls if it's on a rough ground." "Lucky for us, we'll be taking the road in," replied the Major with a grin. "If Billy will let us take it, then we'll use it." 45 minutes later, Stanley and his friends were talking to Billy.
"Why should I give you this tank?"
Billy said.
"I've worked my fucking bollocks off to get this running again, and now you want to use it."
"It would help an awful lot," replied the Major. "We're effectively going on a suicide mission."
"Will you give me further?"
Billy asked.
"What do you want?"
asked Angus.
"I want to work at the depot,"
replied Billy.
"I can do more there."
"You mean you can whiz stuff out of the stores and sell it on the black market?" said Stanley.
"What's what you're saying, you short-ass cockney twat, or you'll find yourself wearing a pair of concrete boots," responded Billy.
"I'll see what I can do," said the Major. "Brigadier Higgins might help. Or as I should say, will help. I got him a case of brandy a little while ago and he owes me.
Right, said Billy, spitting on his hand. Shake on it.
The Major spat on his hand and shook Billy's.
How are we going to drive it? Asked the Major a short time later. I've got no experience as a tank commander.
I do though, said Gruffen. Don't forget, we used a Tiger a few months ago, remember?
You were shooting the gun though, said Cormack.
True, said Gruffen, but the Major has used field artillery pieces before. And he's a crack shot. Isn't that right, Major?
Well, replied the Major nervously, I was rated as such at the training ground, but that was quite a while ago. Gruffen picked up a glass bottle from the floor, walked 60 feet to a wall, and set it down.
Shoot it, said Gruffen. We'll see if you're not up to the job.
The Major pulled out his service pistol, carefully aimed and fired. The bottle shattered as the bullet made contact with it.
I'll ride up top and give directions, said Gruffen. The Major will aim and fire the gun. Cormack will drive and Angus will load.
Will I fit?
Asked the big Scotsman.
I'm not exactly small.
Maybe you're right, replied Gruffen. Stanley will have to load.
It seems like a good plan, replied the Major. We'll take a little infantry with us as well.
Good idea, sir, replied Gruffen. 2 hours later, they were ready. The Mark II Matilda was purring like a cat, its crew waiting for the order to move out. The infantry consisted of Bevan, Philip, Angus and Cyril. Lowe was needed at the field hospital. The brigadier came out to give the final order and stood with a smile on his face.
You lot set a wonderful example to the rest of us,
said Higgins.
I wish there were more like you.
Any idea how many Jerrys we're going to have to muck about with? Asked Stanley.
There's been a report of a Tiger II in the area, replied the brigadier, but that's the only one we know of. There's at least 5 Panzer IIIs and a load of infantry. No one knows if there are any grenadiers.
Great odds, mumbled Gruffen.
Where is the Major? Asked Higgins. Isn't he here yet?
I'm in here, replied the Major, sticking his head out of the turret. I'm firing while Gruffen guides us.
I didn't know any of you even had tank training, said the brigadier.
We don't, said Gruffen with a laugh. We mostly use our gut feelings and such.
Well, said the brigadier, I wish you the best of luck, and hopefully by the time you're done, dinner will be served.
Gruffen and Stanley boarded the tank, and the small infantry group formed up. The brigadier watched them disappear around the corner and thought to himself,
now I've got to get Billy into the depot. Great. More work to do.
Where are we? Asked the Major as they approached the hill, unable to see too much through the cannon's scope. We're nearly there, replied Gruffen. The hill's just in front of us. The infantry tank moved round the base of the hill and came into view of the Germans. It was a German tank crewman who spotted them first. He was in such shock that this British tank had seemingly appeared out of nowhere that he simply pointed at it in disbelief. A few shots pinged off of the Matilda as it came to a halt. The Matilda's turret turned quickly to fire at a Panzer III when a German in field grey came out of nowhere and started waving a white sheet above his head. Gruffen got down from the tank and walked over to the German. The German was huge, around 6 feet 3 inches, but was limping heavily. "Stone in your shoe?" asked the Welshman, offering a cigarette. "Nine," replied the German. "Tin leg. Lost my real one on the Russian front." "Which battle?" asked Gruffen, lighting the German's cigarette with a lighter that he had made himself. "Kursk," replied the German. "Stupid business. Too many casualties for such a ridiculous reason. Hitler must have been drunk on Slivovitz when he thought that one up." "I can believe that," said Gruffen. "Do you want to retire early?" "Do you mean surrender?" asked the German. "I'd love to, and I would, if it wasn't for the fact that there are 8 Gestapo men in the command tent." What about the rest of you? Asked Gruffen. Fuck the Gestapo. There are more of you than them. You're right, of course, said the German. I would like to formally surrender. I assume that you are the commander? No, said the Welshman with a smile. He's manning the gun, but I'll tell him now.
The Major was extremely pleased to hear the news. We'll be given several days' leave for this, said the Major, without even having to fire a single shot. A loud commotion broke out between the German commander and the Gestapo men. Gruffen watched and leaned against the hull of a Panzer III, only 5 feet away from the argument. "You will be hunted down," cried out the Gestapo man in German. "I will have your head delivered to Heinrich Müller's office." "I do not care," replied the giant German commander. "I have formally surrendered, and fully intend to assist the Allies stop this outrage of a war." "You will be eaten by rats before I let you do that," said the Gestapo man. "You are going to die a long and painful death." The Gestapo man turned away from the German commander and faced the troops. "Your commander has revealed himself to be a coward. I am taking command. Capture these enemy soldiers immediately, or you will find yourself shot against the wall." One of the soldiers moved forward and spoke into the Gestapo man's ear. "I do not care what you say," said the soldier. "None of us do. And your other Gestapo cunts can either be peaceably captured by these British soldiers, or you can run away. If you try anything funny, I'll put a bullet through your head." The Gestapo man strode over to the Matilda tank and looked up at the Major. "I order you to surrender," he said, "in the name of our glorious Führer and the Reich." "Why would I do that?" asked the Major. Two beefy hands belonging to Bevan rested themselves on the small Gestapo man's shoulders. "We outnumber you massively," said the Gestapo man uncomfortably. Bevan and Angus lifted the Gestapo man off of the ground between them and marched off towards the German latrines. 5 minutes later, after a lot of screaming and yelps for mercy, they dragged the Gestapo man back to the Major, who had been busy talking about how to write down his report of the surrender to Gruffen and the commander. The Gestapo man's face was covered in rancid brown goo. That could be only one thing. "I would like to formally surrender," was all he said. "Very good," said the Major, pinching his nose closed. "I'll see to it that you are in the report." The Gestapo man scurried off and quietly vomited. The Churchill and Sherman tanks soon rolled into the area, ready for a full-on confrontation, and found the Germans cheering their arrival, their tanks ablaze. "Why did you let them set the Tiger on fire?" asked Brigadier Higgins when he arrived. "You know that the top brass have been itching to get their hands on one of those beasts for ages." "They set it on fire as a symbol of peace," replied the Major, "to show they weren't a threat." "I see," replied the Brigadier. "Good job. How many did you have to shoot before they gave in?" "None, sir," replied the Major. "The commander was only too happy to surrender." "Why?" asked the Brigadier in amazement. "What reason did he give?" "He's a veteran of Kursk," replied the Major. "He's had enough." "Very good," said the Brigadier. "I'll give you all a week's leave, as soon as I can. You seem to have accomplished something that no one else could have." "Thank you, sir," replied the Major with a smile. "The men will be only too glad to hear that." It had been 6 weeks since the food supply vehicles had arrived, and the rations were running thin. Several people had died of hunger, and even Brigadier Higgins, who was usually quite heavy, had become lean. The Germans had had similar problems, but had had better luck. Angus and Cormack had tried hunting for rabbits, but had only succeeded once or twice. It was on a damp day when Gruffen spotted something that could be eaten. "Bayonets out, lads," he said. "We're going to have something to eat tonight that'll make us content." "What are you yabbering on about?" asked Stanley. "We'll be eating horse tonight," said Gruffen. "Horse?" said Angus.
We don't have any horses to kill, and even if we did, we wouldn't be allowed to do it.
True enough, replied Gruffen. But who said that it would be a horse from our side?
Explain it to us then, said Stanley.
Well, the other day when we had to push the Jerrys back, they moved a few of their artillery pieces up. Well, they moved those big guns up with horses, and I've had my eye on one that's been lying on the ground since then.
How do you know it's been there since then? Asked Cormac. And what do we do if it's full of rats?
I've kept a very close eye on it, replied the Welshman. The rats have been eating the dead soldiers' corpses, and that horse died only last night.
Fresh meat, Stanley murmured to himself. It's better than bully beef.
How do we get to it? Asked Cormac. We'll take a box with us, said Gruffen. Stanley and I will take it in front of us. When we get there, we'll cut pieces off of it and put it in the box. Then we'll come back.
What's going on? Asked the Major, turning round the corner.
Gruffen explained the plan, and the Major was pleased with the idea.
We'll have to give some to the Brigadier, said the Major. That'll keep us in his good books. He'll never forget it.
Everyone agreed, and Gruffen and Stanley went off to find a good box. Half an hour later, the two men were crawling across the muddy ground towards the dead horse and their meal.
Mine, said Stanley all of a sudden, coming to a stop. Defuse it, said Gruffen.
Stanley pulled out his bayonet and lifted the mine fully out of the ground. It had shifted up from beneath the ground with the shocks of British and German shelling. Stanley gently unscrewed the top and pulled out the vital component before throwing the different parts away. The two men carried on their way and finally made it to the horse.
Looks like it was a fine beast when it was alive, said Stanley, taking a look at the carcass.
This'll make a fine dinner, said Gruffen. You used to be a butcher or something like that. What parts should we cut off?
Let's see, said Stanley. From what I've heard, the cuts of a horse come out the same as a cow. We'll take the tenderloin, the sirloin, and some of the neck. We can turn that into stew. We'll see if we can cut out a few ribs while we're at it as well.
How long will it take? Asked Gruffen.
About an hour and a half, replied Stanley. It's lying on its side, so it will make it a touch more difficult.
Get on with it, said Stanley. I don't want us to be spotted by the Jerrys. Stanley set to with his bayonet, which he had sharpened just before he had left the dugout. Gruffen kept watch, ignoring the stench from the dead bodies all around, as well as the odour produced from the soon exposed insides of the horse. The box was soon full with horse meat, and locked to prevent its contents from spilling out. It was just before they left that they heard a sound, like that of men crawling from the side of the enemy. Stanley and Gruffen waited for the crawling men to appear, and when they came into view, ordered them to halt. "What are you doing here?" asked the Welshman.
"We're here to collect meat from the dead bird," said one of the Germans, fearfully.
"What's bird mean?" Stanley asked Gruffen, knowing that he knew a little German. "He's talking about the horses," replied Gruffen. "They must have it as bad as us." "Is this one good for butchering?" asked the German.
"Yes," said Stanley. "Do you know what cuts to use?"
"Nein," replied the other German. "We are not of the butchering background." "We've got some in this box," replied Gruffen. "You're welcome to come over to our side. We don't mind deserters, so long as they're from the Wehrmacht and not the SS."
"Could we bring some others with us?" asked the Germans hopefully. "We hate being in the army. We were forced to join up."
"How many do you want to invite?" asked Stanley. 5, replied one of the Germans. "One of them has a terrible Wurzelzung to his leg, so he'll have to be dragged over by a stretcher." "That's all right," said Gruffen, "but you'll have to swear on your souls that it isn't a trick, or it's lights out for all of you." "Nein trick," said one of the Germans. "We'd be only too happy to give ourselves over to the English and the Amerikaner." "Go and get your friends then," said Gruffen. "We'll be waiting for you here." The two Germans crawled off through the stinking mud and bodies to tell their friends the good news.
Do you really think this is a good idea?
Stanley asked Gruffen.
Those Germans are barely adults, replied Gruffen. Did you see their faces? They're gaunt. They don't want to fight.
Stanley nodded in agreement, thinking about their bloodshot eyes and thin hands. 45 minutes later, they heard the sound of a group crawling towards them, dragging something behind them. Their wounded colleague.
You ready?
Stanley asked the lead German.
Jawohl, meine Freundin,
replied the German. The Germans followed the two British soldiers. They were unarmed, deciding that they had better leave their weapons behind in order to show their willingness to surrender. The Major, Angus and Cormack were, to put it lightly, stunned when their two friends arrived back with the Germans. Angus nearly attacking one of them, half believing it to be an attack.
What's your reason for deserting?
The Major asked one of the Germans, an Oberlieutenant.
We do not believe in, and have never believed in Hitler, he replied. It is madness to fight. What is the point of it all? It just causes death. If it had not been for us coming across your scavenging friends, then I fear that we would have never had the opportunity to escape the clutches of the Nazi regime.
You speak very good English, commented the Major.
I have a cousin in England, replied the Oberlieutenant. She used to come over here before the war, and she taught me how to speak in your tongue.
You'll be well looked after, said the Major. But before we hand you over to the Brigadier, let's have a bite to eat first. Stanley had been busy preparing their meal, and they were all soon eating a hearty dinner of roasted horsemeat and stale bread. They felt like kings. The Brigadier was delighted to be given 2 of the huge horse ribs and several slices of the sirloin, and even more pleased to have the group of Germans. At this rate, said the Brigadier to the Major, we may not have to fight at all. It'll be the filling of stomachs that wins this war. If only that were true, sir, replied the Major. If only that were true. As the Matilda tank nosed its way round the corner, several bullets pinged off of its armour. The turret of the 25-ton, 18-foot-long monster turned its gun towards the machine gun nest from which the Germans were firing. A 40mm shell belched forth from the Matilda's main armament, exploding in the machine gun nest. The tank had been put to good use by its crew. This part of the village had been heavily fortified with machine gun nests and a small team of Panzer Grenadiers. The area had been successfully cleared in a record time of 20 minutes. The cupola of the Matilda had opened and a dirty face looked out.
That seemed easy, said Gruffen.
Here, let's have some fresh air, said Stanley.
The crew of the tank clambered out and sucked in the air.
We're not even a tank crew, said the Major, but we certainly seem to be good at it.
Bloke at the greengrocers where I used to live told me about the first tanks on the Somme, said Stanley. He was a big bloke. He said to me that those funny-looking things seemed to break down every 5 minutes, and the fumes from the engine used to make the crews pass out.
I can believe that, said Cormack.
I had an uncle who was a gunner in one of those contraptions. He said that they were mobile coffins.
What happened to him?
Asked the Major. He died just before the war, replied Cormack. His lungs were damaged from inhaling the exhaust smoke from those tanks, and he was left in a degrading condition for the rest of his life.
I'm very sorry, said the Major.
The Brigadier, followed by Angus and Bevan, came round the corner.
Good job, Major, said Higgins. Did your tank break down?
No, sir, we're taking a break, replied the Major.
I see, says the Brigadier. Well, don't stay here for too long. We're going to set up the mobile kitchen in the middle of the village. No doubt the soldiers and the civilians will want to eat, so don't miss it.
A shot rang out from one of the buildings and the Brigadier fell forward. The Major ducked down and grabbed the Brigadier by the shoulders and dragged him round the other side of the tank.
"Higgins, are you all right?" said the Major, holding the trembling form of the Brigadier.
"It's all right," he said, looking at the Major. "Thank God that Jerry Sniper didn't have a better scope."
Blood was pouring from the remnant of his left ear, and the Major pulled out a field bandage and put it over the wound. "I'm afraid that this is the best that I can do," he said.
"Quite all right," said Higgins. "Just blow that fucker up."
"Gruffen, everyone!" called the Major. A loud banging responded to the Major from within the tank. The Major climbed up from the ground, up the side of the Matilda, to the side of the turret where the cupola was, and held his helmet above it. A bullet hit the helmet and sent the piece of headgear flying. "Stay hidden, Higgins," the Major called to the Brigadier as he climbed inside. Angus and Bevan were already firing at the general area of the sniper from well-shielded positions. The Major got himself into the firing position and waited as the turret turned towards the building that held the sniper. The sniper stopped firing and likely tried to make an escape from the building, but the Matilda's shell was too fast for him, and he was crushed to death under a pile of rubble. "Good shooting, Major," said Gruffen. Higgins was holding his hand to his damaged ear, and the Major told Angus and Bevan to take him to the field hospital for treatment. "What now?" said Stanley. "Now," returned the Major, "we'll take the Brigadier's advice and get some grub." Cormack drove the ponderous vehicle through the streets and parked it up next to the Cavalier tank. They had been using the Matilda for several weeks now, and had become quite attached to it. The big, lumbering vehicle acted as a shelter from the rain, as well as bullets. A set of infantry handles had been welded to the sides of it. These were for sending in protective soldiers to protect the tank against the Panzerfaust operators. Billy had attached them himself, but they had never really been used, except for aiding the crew into the tank. Incredibly, the Matilda had had no accidents, or had a track blown off at any point. The five friends stood in line with their mess tins, waiting patiently for their food to be dished out to them. "What's on, Cookie?" asked Stanley. "Soup," said the cook. "Got any bread?" asked Cormack. "Not much," replied the cook, "but for you, you can have a roll each." The hungry soldiers sat down on a fallen tree trunk and tucked into their meal. It wasn't a particularly strong-tasting soup, and the bread was stale, even hard in places, but they enjoyed it nonetheless. "What do you think will be asked of us next?" Angus asked. "Who knows?" replied the Major. "We could be in for anything, so be ready for it." A tall man ran up to them with a piece of paper in his hand, saluted the Major, and extended the note out for him to take. "Would you read it out for me, please?" said the Major, taking a bite out of his chewy bread roll. "I haven't quite finished eating my meal." The tall man opened the note and began to read. "Orders standing," he began. "You are to go to the rise up ahead and check for enemy emplacements. Destroy any that are discovered and hold the rise until the rest of the section reaches you." "Whose orders are they?" asked the Major. "Sidney Lloyd Green, General, sir."
"Not him," said Stanley.
"He fucking hates us with a passion,"
said Angus. "Indeed he does," replies the Major, dismissing the messenger and rubbing his eyes. "But we should move on. Angus, go and fetch Bevan and Percy. You know that chap who uses the heavy machine gun as a hat rack." The men prepared themselves, and when they got to the tank, explained the mission to the two infantrymen. "Who's General Green?" asked Bevan. "You've never met a general like him," replies Stanley, "and you won't want to meet another one like him again."
"Thank you, Private,"
said a voice from behind the Matilda. The Major stood to attention as the General came round the corner of the tank.
"There will never be a general like me," said Green. "I am and always will be your superior. Remember that."
"You're nothing but filth," said Stanley, spitting a ball of phlegm onto the General's shiny boot. "And you'll never be our betters, all right?"
"Private,"
said the General, with a sadistic glint in his eyes. If you value your life, then you'll get down on all fours and lick my boot clean. I'd sooner shit down your throat, replied Stanley.
General Green went bright red and went to strike the small Englishman. Gruffen moved like lightning and grabbed the general's arm.
Major, said the general, you are ashamed of this army. Tell your man to unhand me, or it's a court-martial for the lot of you.
Sir, said the major, you are a pompous ass, who, if given the chance, I would gladly put out of his misery.
Is that a threat, Major?
Said the furious general. No, replied the major, it is an empiric fact.
Get on with your mission,
spat the general,
or I'll shoot you all personally.
Kiss my arse, said Stanley. You don't have the balls to shoot a fucking fly.
I most certainly do,
retorted the general, arrogantly.
Why don't you come with us then? Said Gruffen. You're a tough guy, hard as nails.
I'd rather not be with you lowlife, returned General Green.
You're as weak as wet tissue, said Gruffen. A coward.
The general went purple in the face.
Very well, he said. It would seem that I have to show you that your masters are brave and will not be embarrassed.
The men mounted the Matilda and started off. Cormack barreled the tank along at maximum speed up the rise.
Where did you learn to drive a tank?
Roared the general, blue in the face with a mixture of fear and anger.
I didn't, returned the Irishman. I used to drive tractors back on the farm in Ireland. It seems to be the same principle.
Are any of you trained for tank warfare?
Said General Green in shock. No, said the major.
Who told you could use it then?
Said the general.
We got you off Billy, said Stanley. We did him a favour in return.
And Brigadier Higgins is just fine with that, is he?
Said the general.
He's only too pleased, sir, replied Stanley.
God help us,
murmured the general. The Matilda reached the top of the rise and immediately came into view of a Panzer III.
He's on the same job as us, said the Welshman.
I'm a piercing round in the chamber, Major, reported Stanley.
Shit, said the major. That thing is a 75mm cannon.
What does that mean? Asked the confused general. Just shoot it.
The Panzer III's cannon shot forth a round that ricocheted off of the Matilda's hull and embedded itself into the ground. Firing, said the major. The 40mm cannon roared and a shell bounced off of the Panzer's turret.
Aim lower, suggested
Cormack. The 40mm gun on the Matilda was easily powerful enough for the task of destroying the Panzer, as the German vehicle only had 30 to 50mm of armour. The major aimed the gun of the Matilda at the vision slit of the German tank where the driver was sitting, and another shot echoed through the air. The Panzer exploded in a ball of fire, sending shrapnel into the air, and Angus and Percy into hiding behind the huge bulk of the Matilda.
How did that tiger not kill us?
Said the general to himself.
'Cause it wasn't a fucking tiger, said Stanley. There are other German tanks, you know.
I can smell something, said Gruffen, his nose twitching.
That'd be the general, said Stanley. I do believe he has shat himself. So much for him being our superior.
The tank took up position in a tree line and waited patiently for the rest of the section to arrive. Can you hear something? The major asked Gruffen. Sounds like troops, he replied. They don't sound like they're coming from our direction, said the major. Within a few minutes, a full section of German troops came into view, a great number of them being SS. The major told Angus and Percy to run back to the camp in the village and report what was happening at the rise to the brigadier. When they left, the major gave command to the Welshman, as he had experience with tanks.
Let me out, said the general in panic. We'll surrender.
Cool, said Stanley. He shat himself again. Where does he keep it?
I think you'll find he's full of shit, said Cormack,
Both the top and the bottom lets it out. It's against nature. Move out of the trees, said Gruffen. We'll give them something to deal with before the reinforcements arrive. The big Matilda moved out of the tree line and into the direct path of the German troops. The SS troopers were in shock. The huge green behemoth had seemingly come out of nowhere. The Matilda drove towards the Germans and began to mow them down with both the machine gun and the tracks. The 40mm gun belched fire and smoke, destroying a half-track loaded with soldiers. The Cavalier tank arrived quickly and joined the fight. Soon there was a full-on battle, which the German troops were losing. The Matilda was leading the fight, crushing anything in its path and firing all of its guns. General Greene was quaking with fear and stank like a sewer. Within half an hour, the Matilda, the Cavalier cruiser tank, and the infantry section had stopped the German soldiers. Some were taken prisoner, others fled back down the rise, but everywhere you looked, under trees, in bushes, on the road, there were dead SS. "See what we have to do?" said Stanley to the general. "Go back to your office and remember this experience." The general crawled out of the tank and slowly made his way down the rise, towards the village. "I see General Greene came with you," commented the brigadier to the major. "That was rather brave of him." "Hardly, sir," returned the major. "What do you mean?" asked Higgins. "He's a namby-pamby useless waste of space," said Stanley. "He shot himself twice in the Matilda and tried to surrender." "I see," says the brigadier. "What now, sir?" asks the major. "We'll be staying here for a couple of days," replied the brigadier. "We're waiting for the Americans and their Shermans." "Oh, great," said Stanley. "Americans." "I've got a cousin in America," says Cormack. "He might be with them if he's joined up." The friends drove down the rise towards the village and had the Matilda fueled up and more shells loaded on board. The worst of the fighting was yet to come, and they knew it. The shelling was massive. From both sides came a boom louder than any thunder on earth, something that only man could produce, the sound of imminent death. When the first shells hit, dozens of men were flung into the air, bleeding like living rag dolls. The shelling was kept up on both sides for several hours, the horrors of war showing their ugly faces. Rats swarmed everywhere, thousands of them, gnawing on the bones of the dead. Some were fighting over possession of limbs and chunks of flesh. The villagers were hiding in the woods, and in holes they dug in the ground, praying to God for this terrible thing to stop, so they could carry on living their lives. The Americans, some only 18 to 22, were too shocked to move, stunned to immobility, unable to comprehend the terrifying thing that they beheld. Their government had portrayed the war as being glorious, honourable. As the fresh troops stared in stupefaction, they knew that war was none of these things. As the old hands and the fresh troops organised, some saw an armoured vehicle lumber up the rise towards the German lines. No Shermans supported this lone vehicle. It was only the will to live that would save the men in that Matilda tank. Brigadier Higgins saw the tank moving up the rise. He felt he should stop them, but he knew he couldn't. But perhaps he could assist them in some way. "I want those Shermans mobile now," Higgins demanded. The American colonel smugly lit a cigarette. "Are you deaf?" said the brigadier. "Get those oversized tractors of yours moving." "Listen, brigadier," said the colonel, "unless I get the order from someone higher in authority than you, then my answer is no." "You stupid sod," said the brigadier. "You were to report to me, so you do as I say." "I'm sorry, brigadier," said the colonel with a sneer, "but what I say stands."
"You yellow-bellied, cowardly swine," raged the brigadier. "I have trudged my way through years of this war. I have watched friends die, killed men with my bare hands, given orders that the top brass have given to me, and time again have seen dying soldiers say their last words and written them down, so that their mothers and fathers can know. You will do as I say, or I will take you out of the safety of this tent and show you what it means to be here." "You'll do nothing of the sort," said the colonel. The brigadier pulled out his pistol and held it to the colonel's head, and watched sweat drip down the American's forehead. "Outside," ordered the brigadier. "Now listen," said the colonel. "If High Command hears about this, you're going to be in a lot of trouble." "I have nothing to lose but my life," replies Higgins. "Get your ass moving, and I'll show you the horrors outside." The brigadier forced the colonel out of the tent towards the battlefront. As they walked, the colonel saw the bodies of British and American troops sprawled on the ground, in cars, in trees. Some of them only had their torsos, their legs were gone. The colonel tried to force down the bile building in his throat, but it erupted from his mouth when he saw the exposed skull of a man who was still breathing. He had no face. It had been blown off by shrapnel, and no one had tended to him. The brigadier bent down to the faceless man and did a silent prayer before he pushed the muzzle of the pistol to the temple of the war victim and pulled the trigger. The colonel watched this event in horror while he continued to vomit. Higgins knelt down to be level with the colonel and whispered into his ear, "That is the 572nd time I have had to do that. Get your Shermans moving." The colonel crawled towards the tent and ordered his second-in-command to get the Shermans ready for action. Meanwhile, on the rise, a battle was being fought. "Good shooting, Major," said Gruffen. Cormack was running the Matilda's engine to the limit. They were going 10 miles an hour, uphill, over rough terrain. "How long will it take to reach to the top of the rise?" the Major asked Cormack. "A couple of minutes, Major," replied Cormack. "That's all." The resistance was hard. Several times already the Matilda had to run down German soldiers armed with hand grenades. The main gun had to be used to blow up Panzer Grenadiers, and Gruffen had mowed down a number of soldiers trying to climb onto the tank. "I'm starving," comments Stanley. "You're hungry at a time like this?" returns the Major, looking through his rangefinder. "Loading shells makes you hungry," says Stanley. "We're at the top," reports Cormack. "What now?" "Down the other side," says Gruffen. "They won't be expecting us." Cormack guns down the hill, rolling over soldiers and their supplies alike. The Germans are so stunned they do not know how to react. They were not aware of the tank coming up the rise, because it had killed all of the soldiers in its way. One group of Germans, SS, had set up a heavy machine gun and were hammering away at the intruder. The Matilda's turret swung round and destroyed them with another round of high explosive. High explosive rounds were rare for a Matilda. The charge was too small, but with a little bit of bribery, Billy from Fazakerley had managed to find a crate that had mysteriously fallen off the back of a lorry. "Thank God we're only shooting short distances," the Major muttered to himself. A small SS soldier ran alongside the storming tank and fired a few rounds at Gruffen. The Welshman took a bullet to his left shoulder and shot the SS soldier. "Are you all right?" called the Major through the sounds of chaos. "Fine," said Gruffen. "Panzer Grenadiers right side. They've got a pack gun." The pack gun soon went up in flames, its crew smouldering. "Let's do as much damage as we can," said Gruffen. "Panzer III, 10 o'clock. It's not moving." Stanley shoved an armour-piercing round into the 2-pounder gun breech and reported it. The Major moved the turret round, and the Panzer III was soon nothing more than a burning wreck. An unnoticed Panzer Grenadier
crawled forward on his belly and aimed his Panzerfaust at the Matilda. Gruffen spotted him at the last moment and fires. The grenadier's body convulsed as the bullets penetrated into his body and his finger clenched down on the Panzerfaust's trigger. The Matilda rocked as the German anti-tank weapon smashed into their left track and shattered one of the links. "We've been immobilized," said Gruffen. "Get ready to use the turret. We've just turned into a pillbox." German half-tracks approached the stationary Matilda. Gruffen had sealed the cupola and was bandaging up his arm. Stanley was lighting a cigarette, Cormack was reading his Bible, and the Major was targeting one of the half-tracks. "Just to think," said Stanley, loading the last high-explosive round. "We fought with the Russians, even if it was just for 6 months. We fought with the French, and we managed to make it through all of that. I hope this isn't our last fight." "We all do," replied the Major. "None of us want to die." The Matilda's main gun roared, and one of the half-tracks exploded. "How many rounds do we have left?" Gruffen asked Stanley. 4 armour-piercing," replied the Englishman. "Used a lot," says Gruffen. Someone knocked on the cupola hatch. "Maybe they're inviting us to dinner," joked Cormack. "Come out of the tank now," shouted a very German voice, "or we will blow up your engine and you will burn." "What do we do?" Gruffen asked the Major. "It's pointless trying to resist them," he replied. "If we surrender, at least we'll have a slight chance to survive." Gruffen unlocked the hatch, and the 3 men in the turret heaved themselves out, Cormack climbing out of the driver's compartment. A cruel-looking SS officer looked at them in a cold manner. "So," he began, "you are the British filth that think they can attack the German army and live through it." "Get on with it," says Stanley. "We know you're SS. You don't need to strut around like a prize fucking pigeon." "Who is your commanding officer?" asked the SS officer. "I am," said the Major. "I am their commander." "You led the mission into our camp?" said the SS man. "Actually," said the Major, "Private Gruffen gave the directions and I fired the gun." "What an absurd arrangement," noted the SS officer. "I must congratulate you, though, on your effort. For a tank corps of the British, you certainly did a thorough job, but as always, the Reich stops you before you can make any headway." "We're not a tank crew," replies the Major with a smile. "We're infantry. We just so happen to have a tank." "You will be shot," said the SS officer. The German motioned towards his troops to prepare to fire and execute the British soldiers. "Looks like this is it, lads," says the Major. "I wish we could have survived this war, but at least we die with each other. No doubt Angus will send letters to our relatives and Billy will pinch our belongings." "I think we'll live," said Gruffen, lighting his cigarette. "There are Shermans coming up the rise." The half-track in front of the Matilda exploded as the high-explosive round from a Sherman tank penetrated its fuel tank. The German soldiers spread out and tried to stop the advancing line of American tanks, but were mowed down by infantry that were hiding behind the Shermans. "I get the distinct feeling that the Brigadier organised this," said Gruffen. "What makes you say that?" asks the Major. "He's in the leading tank's cupola," said the Welshman, pointing at the Brigadier, who was giving instructions to his gunner. "Thank God," said Stanley. "At least we can have something to eat soon. I'm famished."
3 weeks had passed, and the British and American armies were making good progress. Stanley had been busy giving food rations out to the villagers when they passed through. Angus had been busy taking care of the munitions, leading them into the camps when the sections were being restocked. The Major had been busy at High Command, writing reports. Cormack had been driving Brigadier Higgins to various meetings, and Gruffen had been recovering from his injuries sustained when they drove their Matilda tank straight into a German base. But after those 3 weeks, all of them met up in Brigadier Higgins' office for a special meeting. "I have called you here for a somewhat special mission," began Higgins. Apparently there is a radar station about 3 miles from here. The Germans have so far managed to stop all attempts to disable it.
What's it got to do with us? Asked Cormac. We're not crack troops.
Not officially, replies Brigadier Higgins. You are, on the other hand, the best we have in this section.
This is gonna be bad, mumbles Stanley.
The top brass want that radar station destroyed, continues Higgins. It's a thorn in their side and a crease in their records. In effect, the toffs want it gone, and they want us to do it.
You took the words right out of my mouth, says Stanley.
So, says the Major, what can we use for this mission? Well, returns Higgins, I have been authorized to use whatever means necessary. Using your unit, your Matilda is still out of action, I'm afraid, but the track parts are being organized by Billy. But I do have something that you might like.
What is it? Asked Cormac.
A Churchill Mark IV, says the Brigadier. It's got a 75mm gun, plenty of shells, and is fully fueled.
Seems like a hefty tank to take on a radar station, comments Angus.
Yes, Higgins replies, but there is a reason why that station hasn't been taken. There is an SS Tiger 1 tank there. Its crew are brutal, and from what I've heard, when they spot infantry, they have a sick tendency to run them under their tracks.
The odds seem a little uneven, says the Major. Why don't we just go around it?
High Command don't want to have a blemish in their immaculate records, says Higgins. No, they want the matter settled.
When do we leave? Asked the Major.
Tomorrow, says Higgins. I suggest that you get a good meal and some sleep.
The men left Higgins' office and went to the mobile canteen. It's going to be a fucking slaughter, said Stanley, eating his soup. Those top brass cunts with their bloody gold chairs and pencils. They can't just leave it be. I know, says the Major. It is possible that that radar station is critical for some other operation that they have planned.
The Luftwaffe's fucked, says Angus. We haven't seen it around in ages. What are they going to do?
Maybe they'll launch balloons at us, jokes Cormac. Oh no, quickly, turn the Spitfires around. The Germans have started a party and the decorations have gotten free. I suggest we finish our dinner and get to sleep, says the Major. I'll tell Bevan and Lowe the same. We'll need a little support with us to throw grenades. The next day, they saw their new Churchill tank. The hull was sound, save for where some of the paint had been chipped off, and where blood marks had been washed off in a vain attempt to get rid of the stains permanently. This thing could use a lick of paint, says the Major, but it'll do. Should we name it? Asked Angus. There's a ton of white paint over there. I could use that. Yes, replies the Major. Let's name the tank. How about Bertha? That's a good name, says Gruffen. The Churchill's engine rumbles as it started up, and Cormac familiarised himself with the steering controls. The team moved off at 9:10 in the morning and would reach their destination about 40 minutes later. The Germans had not bothered placing guards. The Tiger tank crew were constantly watching and listening, waiting for their enemy. The commander of the tank was a cruel man. He had come straight from the Hitler Youth, trained specifically as a tank commander, and though only 20 years of age, had gained quite a reputation. It had been quiet around the radar station. The British and Americans hadn't tried anything for a suspiciously long time. But when he had sent a man to hunt around, he had not reported any enemy build-up, no imminent attack. A sound on the wind caught his attention. Could it be another Tiger, sent to bolster the station's defences? No. It didn't sound like a Maybach. It wasn't purring like a cat. It could only be an Allied tank. But which ally? Couldn't be the Russians, they were on the other side of Germany. The Fuhrer was dealing great blows to their army. Or at least that's what the tank commander had read. It didn't sound like a Sherman,
he had heard, seen, and touched one of those when it was captured. It could only be British.
Otto, go to the north side and tell me if you can find anything, he ordered. I sense an imminent attack.
Otto, a small, meek man, only 19 years of age and fresh out of the Hitler Youth, saluted and marched off towards the north. He reached halfway towards the trees that lined the area around the radar station when a sharp crack echoed through the air. The tank commander stared hard into the trees, waiting for the slightest movement. He didn't have to wait long, as a Churchill tank bolted through the trees directly towards the Tiger tank.
"Hans," said the tank commander, "load armor piercing."
"This ground isn't half bumpy," commented Cormack. "That's what we need, though." "See if you can get around to that tiger's arse," said Gruffen. "That's where we'll be able to use the gun." "That's going to be tough going," replied Cormack. "That bastard is faster than us." "Drive in front of the radar station," responded Gruffen. "He won't fire if we're there." Cormack drove the Churchill towards the radar station, while Stanley loaded an armour-piercing round. While all this was going on, the German tank commander was becoming frustrated.
"Why haven't we killed that Churchill?" he demanded.
"They have moved in front of the radar station," the gunner replied. "If we miss, the station could be destroyed."
"We are the world's true men," raged the commander. "We do not make mistakes. We are perfect. If you are in doubt of your abilities, then you must not be of true German blood."
"Aiming," reported the gunner. "That tiger is eyeing us up," Gruffen called down to the major. "Don't miss him." The major took careful aim on the gun of the tiger, knowing that if he could cripple the huge 88mm gun, then the tiger would be as good as destroyed. Both tanks fired at the same time. The German vehicle had stopped to fire, while the Churchill had carried on driving. The result was spectacular. The Tiger's 88mm round slammed into the radar station, hitting several stored cans of fuel that had been stowed away, causing a huge explosion, destroying the station's equipment and killing its operators. The Churchill's round bounced off of the Tiger's turret, gouging into the thick metal, before angling downwards and embedding itself into the ground. "Stupid Jerry bastard blew up the station himself," said Gruffen with a smile on his face. "The job's been done for us."
"You missed!" bellowed the German commander. "You swine!"
"They were moving at the same time. We couldn't have shot him properly anyway," replied the gunner.
"Do not make excuses," said the commander. "You are filth under the German people's boot, and the great German race will be more pure without you. We have never been and will never be beaten."
"I'm sure our men in Stalingrad felt the same way," shouted the driver, a seasoned war veteran from the Eastern Front. The Germans in the tank began shouting harshly at each other, and the commander was just about to pull out his pistol when he heard a loud explosion.
"They're throwing grenades!"
he screamed. Bevan was swiftly lobbing grenades at the Tiger tank. "That was close," said Lowe. "Try to get one of their tracks off." Bevan threw again, and the grenade landed inside one of the exhausts of the big German armour, just as it moved off. "Wait for it," said Bevan. "It'll go off in a sec." The grenade detonated, and a huge chunk of the Tiger's armour fell off. There was nothing left of the exhaust that the grenade had landed in. As the Tiger manoeuvred to crush the two men with the grenades, the German commander suddenly realised that the Churchill was still driving around. "Bevan's blowing off some of their rear armour," said Gruffen. "Shoot it where its innards are exposed."
"Everyone out!" yelled the German commander. "The Churchill is about to fire!"
The command came too late. The Churchill's 75mm round went through the hole in the Tiger tank's armour, and the engine exploded. The German super weapon blew up in spectacular fashion,
the ammunition began to brew up and released their destructive energy, leaving nothing more than a smoking, burning wreck. "That seemed easy," said Stanley.
Not really, said Gruffen. I think God must have been looking over us when that Jerry fired. I swear I saw that Tiger tank shell change direction.
"Maybe you're right," replied the Major. "It's only the purest luck that could have surely allowed us to do that."
Let's go and pick Bevan and Lowe up, said Gruffen. No doubt they can't wait to get back home. Angus was just coming out of the latrines when the artillery strike began. The Germans were putting up a fight, a desperate fight, which they knew would only prolong the inevitable. The radar station that the team had destroyed had no strategic significance, and both Brigadier Higgins and the Major had been hounding High Command for nearly a week about how stupid it was. Since the radar station had been destroyed, the section had been bombarded by German artillery fire for days at intervals of several hours. Their Matilda tank had been destroyed while it was being repaired. The turret hatch had been left open and a shell had blown the tank up from the inside. After the barrage had stopped, the Major and his team were summoned to Brigadier Higgins' partially destroyed office.
"Just had an order come through," began the Brigadier. "Our base has been half destroyed. We've lost 8 out of the 14 Shermans, your Matilda, several artillery pieces and a few supply lorries. And now, to put the cherry on top, General Stevens wants me to send out some of my men to quickly and swiftly deliver 3 bags of coffee to him."
Is it some sort of secret project coffee? Asked Stanley. Like some sort of truth drug?
"I wish it was," replied Higgins. "I wouldn't complain if it was, but no. It's just 3 bags of coffee that were sent here by accident, and now he wants them delivered to his bloody doorstep."
When do we leave? Asked the Major.
"As soon as possible," replied the Brigadier. "Coffee has been loaded onto a lorry. It's all fueled up, and I can't believe I'm saying this. The General wants the 3 bags under armed guard."
We'll deliver them as quickly as we can, said the Major. The group left Higgins' office and rounded the corner to the lorry. Why doesn't Higgins just lie and say that the coffee was destroyed in the bombardment? Cormack asked the Major. It'd make more sense. It's all official stuff, replied the Major. The Brigadier probably just wants the situation dealt with, so High Command leaves him alone. If the coffee was to disappear, then there would be an investigation. I knew a man once who was investigated for some missing paperclips, said Angus. He would have been court-martialed for thievery if it wasn't for the fact that he died a year earlier. There's some real nutcases out there, said Gruffen. An inkwell went missing when I was being trained. You should have seen the commander. He went potty, saying everyone would be punished if the inkwell wasn't returned immediately. Did the inkwell get returned? Asked Stanley. No, replied the Welshman. A note was left that read, Your inkwell has been taken into custody, as it is believed to be part of a German spy plot. He went quiet after that. Do you know who took it? Asked Stanley. I did, replied the Welshman. The Major and Cormack got into the cab, while Stanley, Angus and Gruffen took position around the bags of coffee. This is ridiculous, said Angus. All for coffee. 2 hours later, after driving down muddy roads and bumpy dirt tracks, the lorry pulled up outside a chateau in the French countryside. A guard stopped their lorry and checked their papers. What are you delivering this coffee for? He asked. General Stevens' orders, replied the Major. Does he know that you are coming with this coffee? Asked the guard. Oi! Shouted Stanley from the back of the lorry. We're here to deliver coffee to General fucking Cockett. I've been cooped up in here for 2 hours. So why don't you shut up and let us get on with our bloody job? The guard went bright red and let the lorry through. You'd make a great diplomat, said Gruffen. The three men unloaded the bags of coffee and waited for General Stevens to come and collect it. A man in a fresh uniform came out of the chateau and inspected the coffee.
"You took your time," said the General. "Rough road, sir," said the Major. My, what excuses," said the General smugly.
"I've heard them all now."
"First the Germans are attacking, and you can't deliver. Then the base is in a state, and everything is disorganized. And now you tell me you were delayed by rough roads."
"With all due respect, sir," said the Major, "those were not excuses. We were being attacked by the Germans by artillery fire. The base was half destroyed, and we were sent as quickly as could be organized. We were helping to put out the fires."
"You are nothing but earthworms," said the General.
"When I was at Eton, if anyone had spoken to me like that, then they would have been kicked out. Oh my, you would have been jailed or shot for insubordination." "We're not there though, are we?" said Gruffen. "We are here, fighting a pointless war, killing people that don't want to fight, and only do it because if they don't, they'll be shot." "Who do you think you are?" said General Stevens, slapping the Welshman. "I'm a former miner from Hoenn. I've dug myself out from cave-ins, dug coal for England, been taken from my place of work and put in the army, learned to kill, slaughtered hundreds in the name of freedom, and now I've helped guard your coffee. And you have come from the soft feather bed of wealth, and you've never had to work for anything. You have no experience of the real world, and I find you and anyone like you a leech on humanity."
"You speak well for a Welsh miner," said General Stevens. "Not bad for a human mole." Angus put his big, beefy arm in front of the Welshman as he went to move forward, knowing full well that the General would be left in a pool of his own blood if he let go. "You have amused me," said the General. "Take the coffee into the chateau and put it in the kitchen." Stanley, Angus, and Gruffen picked up the coffee and carried it into the building. A pretty maid opened the kitchen door and told them where to put the sacks. "That General is a cunt," said Angus. "I hate them all." "Here," said Stanley. "What's all this I hear about the General?" asks a smarmy voice. "Where are you?" asked Stanley, looking round confusedly. "I hate hearing dissent amongst the troops," said a chubby colonel, walking through the back door. "It's bad for morale." "I ride a cockhouse to Banbury Cross," said Stanley. "What's that supposed to mean?" asked the colonel, going purple with rage. "He means get fucked, you walking, talking giblet," replied Angus. "I'll have your shot for this," said the colonel, smiling with glee. "I haven't seen an execution for the longest of times."
"Why would they be executed?" asked the Major, walking into the chateau's kitchen.
"Your men have just insulted me," said the colonel. "So?" replied the Major. "They've just insulted the General, and he didn't mind at all. In fact, he found it rather amusing." "I see," said the chubby colonel, changing his attitude. "If my brother can see the humour in such crude language spoken by you peasants, then I suppose I can as well."
"I'm sure," said the Major. "Come on, boys. We're going back to where real men live and fight." The men left the chateau and got into the lorry, Stanley driving the big vehicle this time. "Why don't we stop off on the way back?" said Stanley to the Major. "Where were you thinking?" asked the Major with interest. "There's a place up ahead called Le Lyrique Caporge, or the Lyrical Toad," replied Stanley. "Sounds respectable," said the Major sarcastically. "Okay, we'll stop off for a drink and a bite to eat." A few minutes later, the lorry pulled up outside a big wooden barn with a bullet-riddled sign telling its name. "Is it safe here?" asked the Major. "Oh, yeah," replied Stanley. "They're a lovely bunch in there. They've got good boxing matches and all." "Boxing?" said the Major. "Yeah, real good punch-ups." The soldiers went into the pub and made themselves comfortable at one of the filthy tables. A large, burly Frenchwoman came over and scowled at the men. "5 of your best beers, love," said Stanley, pulling out his wallet. "Here's the cash." The woman left to pour the beers and put the money in a lockbox. "Are you sure this place is safe?" asked the Major, looking around the huge room at the scowling faces. "Sure it is," replied Stanley. "Me and Billy came here only last week." "That's reassuring," said Gruffen. The woman came back with their beers and left quickly. "What were you doing here with Billy anyway?" asked the Major. "Oh, we had a few drinks, played some cards, sold one of those American tractors." "Stanley, you're joking, aren't you?" said the Major. "No," he replied. A thin man came over in overalls. He evidently worked on a farm. The smell of dung was intoxicating. "You pure Englishman," he said. "The tracker you sold me is mud." "Wasn't when I sold it to you," said Stanley. "I even let you test drive the thing." "Well, it has broken down 3 times already," retorted the French farmer. "Why?" "I can't tell you," replied Stanley. "I can't help it if that tractor's broken down. It was fresh from America. Take it up with them." The French farmer turned on his heel and walked away. "I can't believe you sold a bloody tractor," said Cormac, sipping his beer. "How you got it in the first place is a miracle." "Billy said it fell off the back of a lorry," said Stanley. "When you say fell off, you obviously mean it gently rolled down the ramps of a lorry with the engine and brakes off." Stanley tapped the side of his nose and winked his eye. "So!" came a loud voice from across the pub. "I don't like your English in here. This pub is for Germans." "Germans?" said the Major, pulling out his pistol. Angus, Gruffen and Cormac following suit. "Shut it, Gunther. You're part of the Jetty Army anymore," yelled Stanley. A huge man came from the shadows of the pub and barreled towards the British soldiers. "Who says you little swine?" he said, coming to a stop. "How would you know? I could be SS for all you know." "Shut up," said Stanley. "You're pissed out of your bloody mind, just like you were last week when you told me you were in a penal regiment." "You know this German?" said the Major. "Course I do," replied Stanley. "We did a drinking game together, and I won." "You still owe me money," said the drunk German. "No," replied the Englishman. "You owe me money. I won by 3 cognacs, so unless you got the money with you to pay up with, then piss off." "That's not correct," said the drunk German. "Give me my money or I will kill you, eh?" The German soldier put his hand on Stanley's shoulder and belched into his face. Stanley landed a blow to the big German's chin and sent him reeling. The German pulled out a huge combat knife from his belt and ran towards the Englishman. Stanley sidestepped and tripped the big German soldier up with his foot, sending him crashing to the floor. "This must be the boxing that Stanley was talking about," the Major said to Gruffen. "I kill you, you unter dem stifle schmutz," replied the German, wiping blood from his nose. "That's not a nice thing to say," Gruffen commented. Stanley picked up a chair as the German rushed him and hit him in the face with it, sending him sprawling back onto the floor, amongst the wood splinters that had come from the chair. "How long do you reckon he's got in him?" the Major asked Gruffen. "Which one?" said Gruffen. "The German," said the Major. "Minutes or hours," replies the Welshman. "I saw the Jerry with one leg missing, throwing grenades for a full 10 minutes before he bled out." The German bounced up from the floor and raised his fists. Stanley eyed him up. "If I survive this, which I will, I'm telling my chums back at base where you are," he said. "Then they'll come for you and probably duff you up for info and lob you in prison for 15 years. The German dropped his fists and stormed drunkenly off to the shadows on the other side of the pub. "You dealt with that very well," said the Major, as Stanley sat back down to finish his beer. "What about keywords?" said Stanley. A sinister laugh came from the corner of the pub. Bullets ricocheted around the room as the drunk German tried to focus in on the Englishman and his friends. "Fucking hell," said Stanley, dropping under the table. "Didn't know he still had that bloody thing with him." The friends huddled up on the floor as more bullets embedded themselves in the walls and shattered people's glasses. "If only we were inside Bertha," said Cormack. "That'd be so much safer." "Try and spot the bastard," said the Major. "If we can potshot him, it might scare him away and we can leave." They didn't need to try to see the giant German, because he bolted out into the middle of the French pub and started firing wildly. The Major looked down the sight of his pistol and aimed carefully between the eyes of the mad German giant, but didn't have the opportunity to fire, as a large cast-iron pan, skillfully wielded by the large Frenchwoman who had served them, hit the German on the back of the head and completely knocked him out. "Thank God," said the Major. "So's maintenant," the big Frenchwoman shouted at the British soldiers. "Look what you idiots have done to my place." The five friends bolted out of the door, jumped in the lorry and drove off at 30 miles an hour, down small muddy lanes. "That was something to remember," Stanley said to the Major. "Oh yes," replied the Major, "but please remind me to never take you up on stopping off at a place like that again, wherever we are." "You should see some of the other places I've been," chuckled Stanley, veering down a tiny road. "They're 1,000 times worse than that place." "There are places worse than that?" said the Major in horror. "You wouldn't believe," replied Stanley with a laugh.
"I don't care how you do it, Major," shouted Colonel Hitherby. "Just get it done."
"Yes, sir," replied the Major, who then turns on his heel and leaves the office. The Major has just been told to go on what can only be described as a suicide mission. The concept is ridiculous. He and his friends have survived terrible ordeals, fought and won battles against all odds. A bookie would have a heart attack at the amount of times that they had come out of impossible situations. "He wants you to do what?" bellowed the Brigadier. "It's a secret operation," said the Major. "Technically, my telling you all this could get me court-martialed. It's only because I can trust you that I'm telling you this."
"The damned Colonel," fumed Higgins. "I wish I could strangle him with my socks."
"There's nothing either of us can do about it," said the Major. "Anyway, if you can guarantee us a hearty meal when we come back, I'm sure nothing can possibly go wrong."
"I'll pay for you to go to the finest restaurants that I can find,"
said the Brigadier.
"But by golly, I don't know how you're going to survive."
The Major smiled, saluted, and left Higgins' office. "What's going on then?" Stanley asked the Major upon his arrival. "We're going on a solo operation," replied the Major. "Where are the others? I need to tell everyone all of the details." "They're at the tank painting her up," replies Stanley. "What about Lowe, Bevan, Philip and Cyril?" asked the Major. The two men walked towards where their Churchill tank was being kept and found the new camouflage paint drying off in the sun. The men were busy playing cards and talking while they had a cup of tea. A huge hand came out of nowhere with 2 metal cups of hot, steaming tea and passed them to the Major and Stanley. "Thank you, Bevan," said the Major. Stanley and the Major sat down and drank their tea. "What's this special operation about then?" asked Stanley. "You'll hear it when I tell the others. It'll be easier that way," replied the Major. Everyone finished their tea and cleaned away the paint pots and brushes. "Everybody," began the Major, "I'm afraid we're going on a special operation."
Uh-oh,
mumbled Angus. "Uh-oh indeed," replied the Major. "Operation Clay Pigeon is to commence as soon as I'm finished." "What are we doing then?" asked Cormack. "Colonel Hitherby has ordered us specifically to go ahead of the sections and find out what the Germans are up to and what their numbers are." "Don't sound too bad," commented Stanley. "It gets a lot worse," returned the Major. "The Colonel has also ordered that we smash any fuel depots that we find, and once we find the Germans, engage them in head-on combat." "The Colonel must be fucking mental," said Gruffen. "We'll never survive," said Cormack. "We are to take the tank with us," said the Major, "so at least we'll have our firepower."
Why don't they send someone else out? Asked Angus.
"Probably because we've proved our mettle against the Jerrys," replied the Major. "Now, let's get ready and mount up. Philip, Lowe, Cyril, Bevan, you'll be following us as support. Be sure to pack plenty of ammunition, rations and grenades. Gruffen, you'll be commanding Bertha, as usual. Is everyone ready to begin preparations, or does anyone need to go to the toilet?"
"I'm going for a shit," returned Stanley.
Within an hour, the big, lumbering British tank made its way through the countryside, hunting for the German army.
"Think we'll find anything?" asked Angus.
"Maybe," replied the Major. "I damn well hope not." "Movement, 30 degrees left," said Gruffen. The Churchill's turret turned towards the movement, and the Major spotted something quite extraordinary. 2 deer playing in the tall grass. Gruffen smiled as he peered through his binoculars. "Pretty," he mumbled. An explosion sounded on the outside of the Churchill's hull. "Bastards, 75 degrees right," reported the Welshman, catching a fleeting glimpse of where the Germans were. "Fire high explosive 10 feet in front of them," ordered Gruffen. "That should flush them out. They might know something about what's up ahead." The big tank's gun belched fire and smoke like some infernal device from the boiling pits of hell, and the explosive round hit the ground a few feet in front of the Germans. The Germans were quick to surrender when Bevan and Angus got a hold of them. "They're not bloody soldiers," said Gruffen when the prisoners arrived. The 2 prisoners were dressed in civilian clothes, hats, and wore an armband. "Germans must be getting desperate," commented Lowe. "I can't stand the Volkssturm," said Gruffen. The Welshman climbed down from the tank and looked hard at the 2 Germans. "Do you speak English?" asked Gruffen. The eldest of the 2 raised his hand. "You're free to go, if you can tell us what's up ahead," said Gruffen. "Lots of soldiers," replied the English-speaking German. "Like you?" asked Gruffen. "Nein," replied the German. "Mixed group. SS, Wehrmacht, Panzers." "If you want to surrender to British and American forces, just follow the tracks we've made," said Gruffen. The 2 Germans tipped their hats and started off towards the Allied lines. "Do you think that's wise?" asked Bevan. "They don't want to fight," said Gruffen. "They're just civvies." The group moved forward 3 more miles before they came across the mixed German army group. There were Panzer IVs, Kübelwagens, several half-tracks, and lots of infantry from various units. There were also some grenadiers that would need to be picked off by the 4 infantrymen. It was an SS sergeant that heard the rumble of the Churchill's engine first. The big British tank trundled down the road, and its turret swung to target one of the half-tracks. Bullets pinged off the Churchill tank, chipping the fresh paint. "The bastards are ruining our paint job," said Cormack. The Churchill crushed one of the Kübelwagens beneath its tracks. The Panzer Grenadiers brought up a pack gun and took aim at the British vehicle. The crew of the gun never got a chance to fire. Bevan and Angus mowed them down with machine gun fire. Cyril threw a grenade into a half-track and it exploded in a ball of fire. It had been carrying ammunition and shells. The Panzer IVs tried to penetrate the Churchill's armour, but were swiftly destroyed by the 75mm cannon of Bertha and the grenades from the infantry. Within 15 minutes the Germans were fleeing, leaving behind their tents, supplies, and several vehicles. "Switch the radio on," said the Major. "I think we can report a job well done." Stanley leaned over to the radio and switched it on. The speaker crackled to life, and Higgins' voice erupted through it. "Major! Answer me, damn it, Major!" he said. "I'm here, Brigadier," replied the Major. "We've successfully destroyed an enemy encampment. Several Panzer IVs destroyed, as well as half-tracks and those horrible little cars that they seem to like so much." "Excellent news," replied the Brigadier. "Well done. We've just had reports in. The radios are alive with it."
"We're listening, sir," said the Major.
"Reports coming to us via Russian broadcasts and military communications read as so. Berlin has fallen. I repeat, Berlin has fallen."
A loud roar of exultation came from the inside of the tank and from the outside when Gruffen told the others the good news.
"The Soviets have reached the bunker holding all the Nazi officials. I don't know if they got their claws into that bastard Hitler yet, but I think we can safely say that the war is over."
"So," said the Major, "the war is over." The group sat round a big table that had been dragged out into the street with a bottle of beer each. "What next, do you think?" Cormack asked the Major. "Germany will no doubt be punished, the bigwigs of the Nazi Party will be executed, and so on and so forth." "Germany got punished in the First War, and look what happened," commented Stanley. "I think you'll find that the world has learned about what they did wrong last time, and won't mess it up again," replied the Major.
What are you talking about, lads? Asked a familiar voice.
"Just the end of this war," Angus replied.
"There's going to be plenty of merchandise to sell off," said Billy. "I know a few blokes would be interested in buying a few machine guns and mortars."
"Who?" asked Cormack.
"As for me to know," replied Billy.
"You're awfully quiet, Gruffen," said the Major, taking a sip of his beer. "I'm just thinking about what it is that we're going to do when we go home," replied the Welshman.
"We'll probably go back to our old jobs," said Angus. "I don't mind. I used to be a greengrocer. Worked with my dad. We ran a shop with a man called Carl. Nice bloke. Hated people that took too long inside the shop."
"I'll probably go back to Ireland and get myself a job inside a brewery," said Cormack. "I know a man who can get me into one." "I'm going back to the farm," said Bevan. "I know they'll need me there. My two other brothers joined up with me and got crushed to death under a wall." "I'm going back to the construction job I had," said Stanley. "It'll be in demand for me. What with the bombed out buildings and all that." "I'll see if I can get my job at the estate agents back," said Lowe, "if of course it's still standing."
"I want to be a taxi driver," said Philip. "See if I can get a job as one of them and make good money."
"I'm going back to my job in the Nag's Head," said Cyril. "Plain and simple."
"I'm buying a building," said Billy. "I can rent out the rooms. I've got enough cash from certain investments."
"I'm sure you do," said the Major. "I hope to go back to my job as a bank manager. I'm pretty good at figures and paperwork." "What are you going to do, Gruffen?" asked Stanley. "I'll probably go back to the mines," said Gruffen, "digging out coal." "We should all keep in contact with each other," said Cormack. "We could write letters to one another," said the Major.
"We could use phones as well," said Angus, "when we can afford it."
"We could all get back together again in a few years' time," said Stanley. "Have a big party. Get drunk. Shag a load of women."
"That's one idea," says Billy.
"We're about to enter Berlin," says the Major. "I don't want to hear anything about looting while we're there." "We wouldn't loot," says Cormack. "We might pick up some things off the ground in the streets, though."
"It's not like I've got a team of mates from Liverpool that are going to join me in grabbing a few things," said Billy. "I'd never dream of it, and they're definitely not waiting for us to leave in the American half-tracks."
"I hope not," said the Major with an amused smile.
When do you think we'll be heading into Berlin? Asked Angus. About 12 o'clock this afternoon, replied the Major. We've only got an hour, commented Stanley, looking at his battered watch. We better get ready then, said the Major, standing up from his seat. Brigadier Higgins was busy hounding a private, trying to explain that the key in his car went right, not left, and that he'd have his hide for breaking it off. Ah, said Higgins. Major, I'm going to have to come with you in the half-track. This twit has broken off the key in my car. Oh dear, replied the Major. The mechanics will be able to get that key out before we come back. I hope so, says Higgins. This isn't my car. It's the General's. I'll see you lot soon. I'm off to the mechanics. The group collected their equipment and threw it into the back of one of the big half-tracks. This would be great on a farm, Bevan commented to Angus. I just want to drive all the girls to my house, chuckled Stanley. Do you think that some of the Germans will carry on fighting? Cormack asked the Major. Probably a few of them, replied the Major. There were a great number of fanatics, so yes, I'd say that we'll have to clean them out. What would make you most comfortable right now? Lowe asked Gruffen. Name anything. I'd be the happiest man in the world, if and when I get my civvy clothes on, replied the Welshman. These uniforms are all right, but it's the equipment that you have to strap onto them. What do you think will happen to Hitler? Cormack asked the Major. I think that he'll probably be hung or shot, replied the Major. It'll never be enough, though, and I suspect that most would love to torture him for the rest of his life. He'll get plenty of punishment in hell's fires, said Cormack. Major, said the Brigadier when he arrived, I'll be in the front of the half-track with Cormack. I trust you don't mind being in the back with the men? Of course not, Brigadier, replied the Major. Don't forget to pay up for those cigars I got you, Billy said, passing the Brigadier. Higgins went red and climbed into the half-track's cab. Mount up, ordered the Major. The men climbed into the half-track, with Gruffen and Lowe sitting at the back. I hate that man, says Lowe to Gruffen. Who? Asks the Welshman with a frown. The driver of the lorry behind us, replied Lowe. He always pushes me over when he walks past. He's a right bastard. You should put laxatives in his tea, said Gruffen. What's his name? Asked Angus. Clark, replied Lowe. I know him, says the huge Scotsman. You're right. He's a right cunt. You talking about Clark? Asks Billy. That's right, says Angus. Didn't you sell him a load of razor blades? Yeah, replies Billy. Fucking cunt never got me that tractor that he promised me. Why would he give you a tractor for razor blades? Asks Bevan. I don't know, replies Billy. I'm thinking of something special to get him back with. You should stick a grenade up his arse, comments Cyril. Please, says the Major, let's not do that. The lorry behind the half-track exploded in a ball of flame. What the fuck just happened? Said Stanley in shock. Fanatics! Cried out the Major. Dismount and open fire when you see the bastards. The friends never had time to dismount. The half-track rolled over a row of mines and was hit by a Panzerfaust at the same time. The occupants' bodies were thrown into the air like so many pieces of confetti, most in a state of burning. 2 big SS troops came out of the bushes, laughing at what they had done. That will show the stupid allies what Germans think of them, said one of them. The other German nodded silently and kicked a hand that had been torn off of a body. The 2 SS men heard the sound of footsteps behind them, followed by an enraged wail. They turned to see a small and horrifyingly wounded man coming at them at high speed. The man's face was blackened with burns and some of his skin was missing. His left eye was gone, boiled out of its socket. The left hand had been ripped off of the arm and the man's uniform was black where it had been scorched. In the man's right hand was a large gleaming combat knife. One of the SS men landed a blow to the mutilated man's chest and felt his hand meet a wall of muscle. The burned man slashed at the German's throat with his knife and slit it expertly. The other SS man began to run in shock, no longer the confident SS troop that was so proud of his handiwork. The heavily injured man threw his knife at the fleeing German, and it embedded itself in his right leg. The wounded man tied a piece of cloth around his stump and tried to stop the bleeding. "Nein!" cried the German SS man as the wounded man approached him with a machine gun. "I surrender under the Geneva Convention." "Shut the fuck up," said the wounded man. "You just killed all of my friends. Now I don't give a loving fuck about the Geneva Convention." "But I have surrendered," protested the SS man. "I don't care," replied Gruffen. The Welshman shot the SS man in each of his legs and his arms, then his shoulders, then his ribs were broken with the muzzle of the machine gun, followed by a single gut shot. "I thought the SS liked pain," commented Gruffen as the German twitched on the floor and screamed. The Welshman ripped the combat knife out of the German's leg and cut off his ears. Gruffen stuffed the SS man's ears into his mouth to silence his screams. "I'm going to put you out of your misery now," said Gruffen. "Be glad I'm so merciful." The Welshman lifted up a piece of burning cloth at the end of the machine gun and threw it onto the SS man. After a few moments, he watched the German fanatic scream as his flesh burned. Gruffen heard the sound of an approaching vehicle and turned to see an American jeep approaching. It was at this point that the Welshman passed out from blood loss. 1 week later, Gruffen woke up in a clean hospital with crisp linen and the smell of strong antiseptics. "So," said Gruffen, giving the nurse a start. "This is heaven. Didn't expect to go here." "This isn't heaven," said the nurse with a smile. "You're in hospital. How are you feeling?" "I'm missing one eye," replied Gruffen. "I've lost one of my hands. I think I have burns. And all of my closest friends are dead. All things being equal, I don't think I'm doing too bad." "I heard something about what happened," said the nurse. "Something about a road bomb or some sort of rocket." "Mines and a Panzerfaust," said Gruffen. "I heard that the Germans who set it up are dead now. When they picked you up, one of the bodies was burning," said the nurse. "I killed them both," said Gruffen simply. "Good," returned the nurse. "They were SS, weren't they?" "That they were," replied the Welshman.
"Private Baddon," said an unfamiliar voice. "I'm here to take your account."
Gruffen looked up at the face of a fat colonel. "I've just woken up," said Gruffen, "and you're going to ask me questions."
"I'm afraid it's imperative," said the colonel.
2 SS attacked the half-track and the lorry, killed everyone but me, and then I killed them," said Gruffen.
"What was your reason for killing them?"
asked the colonel, writing down what was being said in a thick notepad. "They killed everyone," replied the Welshman. "Everybody in the half-track was a friend of mine. So, being the last one left, I took action on 2 SS scum. That's it."
"Did either of the SS men surrender?"
asked the colonel. "No," replied Gruffen. "They both tried to fight me. One of them punched me in the chest. The other one ran backwards and tried to strafe me, but I killed him first." "Colonel," said the nurse, "perhaps it would be wise to let this patient rest." The nurse had noticed a dangerous glint in Gruffen's eye and would mean trouble if the colonel didn't leave quickly.
"You're quite right," said the colonel, closing his notepad.
Gruffen's face relaxed a little as the colonel began to walk away. "Colonel," Gruffen called. "I was the only survivor left, wasn't I?"
"I'm afraid so," replied the colonel, turning to face the Welshman. "Medics were very thorough. I'm sorry."
The colonel left, and Gruffen sat back in his bed, a pillow propped up behind him. "I think you were very brave to take on those 2 men from the SS," said the nurse. "They didn't stand a chance," replied Gruffen. "I don't think anyone could have survived the rage that I had inside me then." "Get some rest," said the nurse. "I'll come back and check on you in an hour or so." The nurse checked Gruffen's facial bandages and left. 2 small birds landed on the windowsill outside, and Gruffen watched them sing and peck at the moss that had built up in the corners of the small ledge. The Welshman had a mix of emotions. Some were nasty, cruel, vengeful. Others, sorrowful. As a tear rolled down Gruffen's cheek, he thought about all of the families that would be hoping for his friends to return to them, and the disappointment, and decided that he'd write to each of them, telling them about all of the things that they had done together. Tell them about what they had seen and how he had avenged them. Gruffen fell into a deep sleep, and for the first time in several years, rested easy.